Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable. Maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just the quiet corner of the room where the day finally stops asking things from you. Tonight we're going somewhere cold. Not cold in the ordinary way. Not the kind of cold where you complain and turn up the heat and forget about it 10 minutes later. We're going to the mountains of Korea in the winter of 1950, where the ground was hard, the air cut through wool and canvas, and men learned that darkness could have a sound. Not one sound, actually. Several. A whistle, a bugle, a shout rolling down from a ridge, a burst of gunfire from a place that had been empty a moment before, and then the terrible realization that the night itself seemed to be moving. Tonight we're talking about how Chinese night attacks terrified US soldiers during the Korean War. And I want to be careful with that word, terrified, because it can sound cheap if we use it carelessly. It can sound like we are turning real men into characters in a campfire story, or turning war into entertainment, and that is not what we are doing here. The terror was real because the situation was real. These were young Americans, many of them barely out of school, standing in holes cut into frozen hillsides, trying to understand an enemy they had been told was not supposed to be there in such numbers. They had rifles, machine guns, artillery, radios, trucks, tanks, aircraft, and all the equipment of a modern army. And still, night after night, they found themselves waiting in the dark for men who seemed to come out of the ground itself. Before we go deeper, let me ask you something simple. What time is it where you are right now? Is it late? Are you listening from bed? From a couch? From a kitchen with one light still on? Maybe you're somewhere quiet, with the rest of the house asleep. Maybe you're walking or working or trying to settle your mind after a long day. Wherever you are, I want you to notice something for just a second. Notice the light around you. Notice how easy it is to keep the dark away. A lamp, a phone screen, a street light outside the window, the soft glow from another room. For most of us, darkness is something we control. We turn it off and on. We dim it. We decorate it. We sleep through it because we trust the walls around us. But for a soldier in Korea in 1950, especially after the Chinese entered the war in force, darkness was not empty. Darkness was not rest. Darkness was when the fighting often began. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history told slowly, carefully, and with attention to the ordinary human experience inside enormous events, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when something in the story makes you stop for a moment. Do it when the past begins to feel less like a date in a book, and more like a room you have stepped into. And if you want to tell me where you're listening from tonight, leave it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing all the places these stories travel after I let them go. Now, let us go back to Korea. The year is 1950. The war has already moved with a speed that almost no one expected. In June, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and drove south. Seoul fell. American and United Nations forces were pushed into the desperate defensive pocket around Busan. Then came the landing at Incheon in September, one of those military gambles that changed the whole shape of the war in a matter of days. North Korean forces were pushed back. Seoul was retaken. United Nations troops crossed the 38th parallel and moved north. By autumn, some men believed the war might soon be over. There was talk, real talk, of being home by Christmas. That phrase would become one of the cruelest phrases of the Korean War, because the men who heard it were not going home. They were walking toward a different war entirely. Here is the thing that makes the Chinese intervention so unsettling when you read the accounts from that period. It did not begin, for many American soldiers, as a clear announcement. It began as rumours. It began as prisoners who seemed to come from somewhere they were not supposed to be. It began as small contacts in the hills. A patrol would bump into enemy troops and come back with reports that did not fit what headquarters wanted to believe. Men heard that Chinese soldiers had crossed the border from Manchuria. Some believed it. Some did not. Some officers thought the Chinese were present only in limited numbers. Some assumed they were volunteers in a loose sense, not a massive force capable of changing the whole war. The name used in many American reports at the time was CCF, Chinese Communist Forces, though the Chinese called them the People's Volunteer Army. Whatever name was used, by late November 1950, they were no longer a rumour. On the night of November 25th, Chinese forces struck the US 8th Army along the Chongchon River. The US Army Center of Military History describes Chinese troops charging to the sounds of bugles, finding gaps between American units, and attacking their flanks near a hill called Chinaman's Hat. I want you to pause on that for a moment. Not the map, not the operational language, not the neat words that military history uses because it has to organize chaos into sentences. Think about the soldier on the ground. He's tired. It is cold. He has been told to expect resistance maybe, but not this. He is listening to the night, and then he hears a bugle. A bugle does not sound like a rifle. It does not sound like artillery. It is human breath pushed through metal. It has intention in it. On a parade field it can sound formal, almost clean. In a frozen valley at night coming from somewhere beyond the wire, it is something else entirely. It tells you that men are out there. It tells you they are organised. It tells you they are close enough for sound to reach you clearly. And then, if you are very unlucky, other sounds follow. Whistles, shouts, grenades, the scraping movement of boots on rock and snow, the sudden, snapping fire of burp guns, the American nickname for compact Soviet-style submachine guns used by Chinese and North Korean troops. The first few seconds must have felt impossible to sort out. Is the attack coming from the front, from the side, behind us? How many are there? Why are they already so close? This is one of the hardest things for modern readers to understand about night fighting in Korea. The battlefield was not flat and visible. It was not a chessboard. Korea was hills, ridges, draws, narrow roads, frozen streams, terraces, villages and mountains that broke units apart and swallowed sound in strange ways. A position that looked secure in daylight could become uncertain after sunset. A ridge that seemed empty could hide men who had spent the day motionless. A road that looked like a route of retreat could become a trap if infiltrators cut it behind you. The Chinese understood this terrain, and even more importantly, they understood what the terrain could do to an army that depended on roads, radios, vehicles, and clear lines of command. Now, I want to make something clear early, because it matters. Chinese night attacks were not magic. They were not proof that Chinese soldiers were somehow inhuman, and they were not the simple, mindless human waves that appear in some older descriptions of the war. That phrase, human wave, has been used so often that it can flatten the reality into something crude. The truth was more complicated and more frightening. Chinese forces often moved with discipline, patience, and skill. They infiltrated through gaps. They studied American habits. They used darkness to reduce the advantage of American air power and artillery. They accepted casualties that shocked US soldiers, yes, but they were not merely throwing bodies at machine guns without thought. Many of their attacks were coordinated by whistles, bugles, horns, bells, and shouted commands because radios were scarce. Batteries were unreliable in the cold, and simple sound signals could carry across broken terrain. A recent military history discussion from Osprey notes that veterans often remembered these sounds as a terror weapon, while Chinese documents suggest they were primarily practical battlefield signals used to compensate for limited wireless communications. But here is what matters for the men hearing them. Intent and effect are not always the same thing. A bugle used for communication can still terrify the man waiting in the foxhole. A whistle used to direct movement can still sound like the beginning of the end. Cymbals or horns used to signal an assault can still make a Marine at Chosin feel as if the dark has split open. A Marine Corps account of Chosin describes Chinese troops attacking at night with blaring bugles, shrieking whistles and clashing cymbals. a phrase that sounds dramatic until you realise it is trying to describe something many veterans remembered for the rest of their lives. Let us imagine one of those nights, not as a movie scene, but as a physical experience. You are a US soldier in late 1950. Maybe you are with an infantry regiment somewhere along the Chongchon. Maybe you are a Marine near the Chosin Reservoir. Maybe you are part of a roadblock position, a company perimeter, a hill outpost, a frozen line that someone at headquarters marked with a grease pencil and called defensible. You have been cold for so long that cold is no longer an event. It is the condition of being alive. Your boots are stiff. Your socks are damp or frozen. Your hands hurt even inside gloves. If you touch metal carelessly, your skin may stick. You have learned to sleep lightly if you sleep at all, because sleep can become dangerous when attacks come after dark. The day had its own danger, of course. Artillery could fall in daylight. Snipers could fire. Patrols could run into ambushes. But daylight at least gave shape to fear. You could see the slope in front of you. You could identify a tree line, a boulder, a fold in the ground. You could watch for movement. At night, distance became guesswork. A sound could be 50 yards away or 500. A flare could rise and turn the hillside white for a few seconds, and in that brief light you might see figures moving, or you might see nothing at all, which was sometimes worse. Because nothing did not mean safety, it meant waiting. There is something about waiting for a night attack that gets inside a person differently from the attack itself. Once the firing starts, training takes over. You load, you fire, you shout, you throw grenades, you drag ammunition boxes closer, you try to hear orders, you try to stay alive until the next minute, but before it starts there is only anticipation. Men listen too hard. The mind begins to invent patterns. A rock sliding somewhere beyond the wire becomes a patrol. Wind in brush becomes movement. A distant shout becomes a signal. The body prepares itself again and again for violence that has not yet arrived. That is exhausting in a way sleep cannot fix. And then comes the sound. Not always the same sound, not always in the same order. Sometimes grenades first, sometimes small arms, sometimes whistles, sometimes bugles. At Chosin, one Marine Corps University press remembrance describes men arming themselves as daylight faded, even rear area personnel and wounded men asking for weapons, because everyone expected another night assault. In that account, the attack began with grenades, then bugles and whistles directing the assault, and suddenly Chinese soldiers were everywhere around the perimeter. That word suddenly appears often in memories of these actions. Suddenly, they were there. Suddenly the hill was full of them. Suddenly the rear was no longer the rear. Suddenly the line was not a line but a series of isolated holes with frightened men inside them. This is where the fear became more than fear of death. Soldiers in every war feared death. That is not unique. What made these night attacks especially terrifying was the feeling of being penetrated, surrounded, bypassed. American units were trained to think in terms of fronts and flanks, lines and supporting fires, fields of fire and command posts. Chinese attacks often attack those assumptions. They came through gaps between units. They struck from unexpected directions. They tried to cut roads and isolate positions. They sent small groups around the sides and into the rear. A man might be facing forward, watching the obvious direction of attack when firing began behind him. Few things are more damaging to morale than the realization that the map in your head no longer matches the ground under your boots. There is also the matter of numbers. Many American veterans remembered the Chinese as coming in endless waves. Sometimes that memory came from the actual size of the assault. Sometimes it came from the way night exaggerates everything. If you fire into darkness and men keep appearing whenever a flare goes up, how many are there? If bugles sound from one ridge, then another, then behind you, how many units are involved? If a group is cut down and another group appears moments later, is it a new wave, or the same attack reforming, or another unit you never saw approach? In daylight, numbers can be counted badly, but at least counted. At night, numbers become emotional. They become a pressure. They become the feeling that no matter how much ammunition you fire, the dark keeps producing more men. That feeling mattered because American firepower depended on control. Artillery had to know where to fire. Mortars needed coordinates, or at least clear direction. Machine guns needed fields of fire. Air power, one of the great advantages of United Nations forces, was far less useful in darkness and bad weather, especially in the mountains. The Chinese did not eliminate American firepower, but night helped them get closer before that firepower could be brought fully to bear. And close fighting was different. Close fighting removed distance, and distance is one of the things that help soldiers remain functional. At 200 yards, the enemy is a target. At 20 yards, he's a man coming over the edge of your hole. Now, I want you to think about the sound inside that position. We often talk about what soldiers saw, but in these attacks, what they heard may have mattered just as much. The metallic call of a bugle, the sharp blast of whistles, men shouting in Chinese, American officers yelling orders, someone screaming for a medic, machine guns firing until barrels overheated, rifles cracking, mortar rounds landing with that thick concussive thump that the body feels before the mind names it, grenades exploding close enough to throw dirt and snow into your face. And underneath all of that, sometimes, the strange silence between bursts when everyone is reloading, listening, trying to figure out whether the next movement in the dark is friend or enemy. There were flares too. Flares are one of those battlefield details that seem simple until you imagine them properly. A flare rises, burns, and hangs under a small parachute, turning the ground beneath it into a temporary colourless world. Shadows stretch, snow reflects, men freeze or run. The light is brief, and because it is brief, it teaches the eye to panic. You see too much and not enough. A shape near the wire, a body on the slope, a helmet, a hand. Then the flare burns out and everything disappears. The darkness after a flare can feel darker than it did before. In those conditions, rumours moved quickly. Rumours always move quickly in war, but they move faster at night. One company hears that another has been overrun. A runner says the road is cut. Someone says the Chinese are wearing white camouflage. Someone says they are playing dead. Someone says they are already behind the command post. Some of it is true, some of it is not. The problem is that in the middle of a night attack, the difference between true and false may not become clear until morning, and morning is a long way off. There is a tendency, when telling this story, to focus only on the Americans, because the topic is how the attacks terrified US soldiers. But the other side of the hill matters too. Chinese soldiers were also cold. Many were poorly supplied for the Korean winter. Some had inadequate shoes, some carried limited ammunition. Many moved at night because daylight exposed them to aircraft and artillery. They climbed mountains in silence, waited in freezing positions, and attacked men with heavier weapons than their own. Their bugles and whistles, terrifying as they sounded to Americans, were also signs of an army solving practical problems under brutal conditions. That does not make the attacks less frightening. It makes the whole scene more human, and therefore more difficult to dismiss. The Korean War often gets called the Forgotten War. That phrase is useful, but it can also become a way of not looking too closely. Forgotten by whom? Not by the men who heard those bugles. Not by the Marines who fought their way out from Chosin. Not by the soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Division fighting near the Chongchon. Not by the men at Chipyong-ni, where later in February 1951 Chinese forces attacked a surrounded US and French position at night, with defenders hearing bugles, whistles and bells before assaults along the perimeter. Not by anyone who learned that darkness had habits, and that the hour after sunset could be more dangerous than noon. Here is what I find most unsettling about this subject. The Chinese night attacks did not terrify US soldiers because Americans were weak or untrained or unusually fearful. They terrified them because they attacked the human nervous system at its most vulnerable point. They came when men were tired. They came when vision was limited. They came in cold that made every movement slower. They came with sounds that were unfamiliar and hard to interpret. They came from directions that broke the comforting idea of a front line. They came after days of rumours and uncertainty. They came when the mind most wanted rest and the body most needed sleep. That is not ordinary fear. That is fear engineered by circumstance, terrain, weather, timing, and sound. And for many men, the worst part was knowing it might happen again tomorrow. Because after a night attack, morning did not bring peace. Morning brought counting the living, counting the wounded, counting ammunition, counting the men who had been there yesterday and were not there now. Morning brought the sight of the ground that darkness had hidden. Bodies on slopes, equipment scattered near foxholes, frozen weapons, torn wire, blood in snow or mud. It brought officers trying to re-establish lines, medics moving among the wounded, men making coffee if they could, men smoking with hands that still shook. It brought the strange daylight embarrassment that sometimes follows terror, when a soldier who spent the night certain he would die now has to stand up, stamp his feet against the cold, and act like a soldier again. But we're not at morning yet. We're still at the edge of the first night. We're still with the men who do not know what is coming, or know only enough to dread it. We're still in that hour when the hills are darkening, and the ridgelines are turning black against a winter sky, and somewhere beyond the American positions, Chinese soldiers are moving into place. Some are carrying rifles, some have grenades, some have whistles hanging from their necks. Somewhere, a bugler waits for the signal. Somewhere, an American private pulls his coat tighter around himself, checks his ammunition, and tries not to stare too long into the dark, because the longer he looks, the more the dark seems to look back. The first bugle has not sounded yet, but it is coming. The first sound was not always a gunshot. That is the detail that stays with you once you begin reading the accounts closely. We expect war to announce itself with explosions, with artillery tearing the hillside apart, with machine guns cutting through the dark. And of course those sounds came too. They came quickly. They came in such volume that men later remembered whole hillsides flashing and snapping with fire. But for many American soldiers who first met Chinese troops in Korea, the sound that reached them first was thinner than that, stranger than that, almost old-fashioned. It was a bugle. Not a bugle played in ceremony, not the clean morning call of a camp waking up, not a sound connected with flags or parades or boys standing straight in polished shoes. This was a bugle coming out of a Korean hillside as the light was dying. It came from somewhere beyond the American line, from a place that looked empty, from a ridge or draw or patch of trees that men had perhaps stared at all afternoon without seeing anything move. Then the note rose into the cold air, and for a moment it may have seemed almost unreal, because a bugle belongs to a human being. Someone has to lift it. Someone has to breathe into it. Someone has to know that other men are listening for it. And that meant the darkness ahead was not empty at all. Let us go to Unsan, North Korea, on November 1st, 1950. This is not yet the full disaster along the Chongchon River later that month, and it is not yet the terrible fighting around the Chosin Reservoir. It comes before those larger shocks, when many officers and soldiers still believed the enemy in front of them was mainly North Korean, weakened, scattered, running north toward the Yalu. The war had moved so quickly after Incheon that confidence had become part of the weather. Men had seen North Korean resistance collapse in many places. Roads were crowded with movement north. Units were stretched across difficult country. The map showed objectives, rivers, roads, towns, and hills, but maps do not show doubt very well. They do not show the spaces between units where an enemy can slip through. They do not show the private assumptions carried in a soldier's chest when he believes the worst of the war may already be behind him. The US Army Center of Military History describes Chinese troops emerging from the hills near Unsan in the dying light on November 1st, blowing bugles, throwing grenades, and firing the compact automatic weapons American soldiers often called burp guns, had surprised men of the 8th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. The same account says survivors of those first attacks were shaken by the sight of mass Chinese infantry, and that thousands of Chinese troops struck from the north, northwest and west against scattered American and South Korean units. Now, read those directions again, slowly. North, northwest, west. That is not a simple frontal attack. That is not one line of men meeting another line of men in a way that can be cleanly understood. For the soldier on the ground, those directions meant the enemy was not where he was supposed to be. The enemy was not only ahead, the enemy was around. And once that feeling entered the line, once men began to understand that the hills themselves had been hiding thousands of soldiers, fear changed shape. Before the bugles there had been warnings. Some were diplomatic, some were intelligence reports. Some were battlefield signs that were too easily explained away. Chinese prisoners had already been captured in Korea. China had sent signals through diplomatic channels that it would not tolerate hostile forces moving close to its border. There were officers who took these warnings seriously, and there were others who believed Chinese involvement would be limited or unlikely to alter the war. The belief that air power and American firepower would cripple any Chinese intervention was strong in some quarters, and it fit the mood of advance. The problem was that the Chinese soldiers crossing into Korea were not simply a mob of poorly supplied men. Many were veterans of long fighting in China's civil war, men led by officers who had spent years learning how to move, hide, infiltrate, and attack under difficult conditions. That is one of the quiet traps of military history. Armies often fear the enemy they know and misunderstand the enemy they have not yet had to face properly. The US Army in Korea knew artillery. It knew tanks. It knew airstrikes. It knew how to fight with radios, supply columns, road movement, command posts, and fire support. Chinese forces had many weaknesses by comparison. They lacked the heavy equipment, the motor transport, and the communication systems available to American units. But weakness in one kind of war can become strength in another. An army without many trucks does not depend on roads in the same way. An army without constant radio contact learns to use runners, whistles, bugles, and prearranged signals. An army that cannot dominate daylight from the sky learns to move by night. And so the bugle at Unsan was more than a sound. It was the arrival of a different kind of war. Imagine a man from the 8th Cavalry Regiment at the edge of that evening. He has probably been tired for days. He has been moving north through country that is difficult even before winter fully claims it. The roads are narrow and unreliable. The hills come close. The villages are poor and damaged. The air carries smoke, cold dust, and the stale smells of soldiers who have been wearing the same clothes too long. He may have heard rumours that Chinese troops are in the area. He may have laughed at them, or worried about them, or decided not to think about them because a soldier cannot afford to fully believe every rumour. He has tasks in front of him. Check ammunition. Dig deeper if the ground allows it. Clean the rifle. Find something to eat. Keep warm. Listen for orders. Try to sleep if sleep is possible. Then the light begins to go. This matters. The timing matters. Dusk is not simply the start of night. Dusk is a period of confusion. The eye fails gradually. A man can still see enough to believe he understands what is around him, but not enough to be certain. Shapes lengthen. Rocks become crouched figures. Brush becomes movement. A line of trees becomes a wall. The sky may still hold light while the gullies below have already gone black. Men who have spent the day watching the hills find that the hills are changing in front of them. The familiar outline becomes unfamiliar. The enemy understands this. A unit waiting to attack at dusk receives a small gift from nature. The defender loses certainty just before he loses sight. The bugle comes then. Maybe one man hears it first and turns his head. Maybe several men hear it at the same time and freeze without speaking. It is possible that for 1 or 2 seconds no one knows what it means. Then another sound answers, perhaps from another slope, a whistle, a shout, a sudden crack of fire. Grenades begin to land. The first explosions throw dirt and frozen fragments into the air. Someone yells that they are coming. Someone else yells a direction. The direction may be wrong. Men grab rifles. A machine gun opens. The muzzle flashes reveal nothing and everything at once. Figures are moving where no figures should be. The attack is not forming at a comfortable distance. It is already close. The American nickname burp gun referred especially to the harsh, fast sound of enemy submachine guns, often Soviet-designed or copied weapons that fired pistol-caliber rounds at close range. It was not a formal name, but soldiers do not wait for formal names when something is trying to kill them. They name what they hear. The weapon seemed to burp because of its rapid bursts. In the dark, the sound could be hard to place. A burst from the left, another from the front, another from the rear of a position that was not supposed to have a rear under attack. That is what close-range automatic fire does at night. It collapses the map. It makes a man feel surrounded before he can prove whether he is. At Unsan, the situation began to break down with frightening speed. The South Korean 15th Regiment on the American right flank collapsed under the attack, while the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 8th Cavalry fell back toward the town. By morning, as positions were being overrun and guns fell silent, men tried to withdraw, but Chinese roadblocks behind them forced many to abandon artillery and move into the hills in small groups. The centre of military history's account says only scattered survivors made it back, and that the regiment lost more than 800 men, nearly a third of its strength, in those initial attacks by forces many had only recently treated as rumour. There is a phrase in that account that deserves attention: guns falling silent. It sounds almost peaceful if you're not careful. In reality, it may mean crews killed or wounded. It may mean ammunition gone. It may mean a position overrun. It may mean artillery pieces that had represented strength only hours before are now useless metal because the men who served them cannot stay. Silence in battle is not always relief. Sometimes silence is the sound of a line failing. Let us stay with that moment, because this is where the terror of Chinese night attacks becomes clearer. A soldier can endure fear when he believes the system around him still works. He can be afraid and still function if he trusts that his company is on one side, another company is on the other, artillery is behind him, command knows where he is, and a road exists if withdrawal becomes necessary. The Chinese attack at Unsan damaged that trust. It did not simply attack men. It attacked the arrangement that made men feel less alone. The front bent, then blurred. Flanks became open. Roads that should have been safe became blocked. Groups that should have been connected were separated. Men who expected orders sometimes received none, or received orders too late, or heard conflicting instructions in the noise. Small groups moved through darkness, trying to find friendly lines, carrying wounded when they could, and leaving behind what they could not carry. Vehicles and guns that had seemed essential in daylight became burdens when the road was cut. The hills, which had been background, became the only possible route out, and always there was the sound. This is why the bugle became so memorable. It did not cause the tactical disaster by itself. It did not destroy the regiment. It was not a weapon in the ordinary sense, but it marked the moment when men understood that the enemy had arrived in a way they had not expected. A bugle can organise attackers. It can signal a phase of assault. It can tell one group to move while another presses forward. It can help compensate for the lack of radios in rough country. But to the men on the receiving end, it did something more personal. It announced that the enemy was confident enough to make noise. It announced that the darkness belonged, at least for the moment, to someone else. Now I want to pause and be fair to the Chinese soldiers in this story, because it is easy to describe them only as shadows and sounds. They were not shadows. They were men, many of them cold, hungry, exhausted, and under orders just as strict and frightening in their own way as any American orders. Many had marched long distances by night to avoid air attack. Some carried little food. Some had thin clothing for weather that would punish anyone. They knew American artillery and aircraft could tear open a formation caught in daylight. They knew they had to get close. close enough for grenades, close enough for submachine guns, close enough that American firepower could not simply remain a distant machine. Their night attacks were frightening because they were effective, and they were effective because they were born from necessity as much as doctrine. But understanding the necessity does not soften the experience for the men who heard them coming. There is a difference between danger you can see and danger you can only assemble from clues. At night, the mind becomes a clerk of small evidence, a snapping twig, a scrape against stone, the slight clink of metal, a low voice in a language you do not understand, the smell of smoke or sweat or disturbed earth. Then a bugle note, and suddenly every small clue from the last hour rearranges itself into one terrible conclusion. They were there the whole time. This is what many American soldiers had to learn in Korea. The enemy did not need to be visible to be close. During the day, Chinese forces might vanish into hills and valleys. After attacking, they might disappear again, leaving soldiers unsure whether they had withdrawn, regrouped, or simply gone to ground nearby. The Center of Military History notes that after early November attacks, Chinese units seemed to vanish back into the hills and valleys, and by November the 6th all was quiet again, which only deepened the uncertainty. Quiet can be worse after an attack. Before the first attack, quiet may feel like safety. After the first attack, quiet becomes suspicious. Why is it quiet? Where did they go? Are they watching? Are they waiting for us to move? Are they on the next ridge? Will they come again tonight? A soldier who has been surprised once does not return easily to innocence. The night keeps the memory of what it did. At Unsan, one of the most chilling incidents came with the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Cavalry. According to the army account, early on November 2nd, that battalion was hit by similar bugle-blowing assaults, and in the confusion a company-sized Chinese element was mistaken for South Koreans and allowed to pass a critical bridge near the battalion command post. Once over the bridge, the enemy commander blew his bugle, and Chinese troops overran the command post with satchel charges and grenades. Think about that. Not simply an attack from outside the perimeter, not a distant enemy rushing up a hill, but confusion so complete that men could pass through a vital point because they were taken for allies. The bugle then becomes almost unbearable in the imagination. It is not coming from the far hillside anymore. It is inside the space that was supposed to be controlled. It is beside the command post. It is the sound of realization arriving too late. War is full of mistakes made under pressure, and it is easy for people far away and many years later to judge them. But in darkness, amid mixed units, broken lines, unfamiliar terrain, language barriers, exhausted men, and troops moving through the same roads and bridges, recognition could fail. A helmet shape, a silhouette, a shouted word, a moment's hesitation, and the wrong decision becomes fatal. That is what night does. It turns identification into a gamble. And once command posts are threatened, fear spreads in another way. Frontline soldiers expect danger. They do not like it, but they understand it. Command posts, aid stations, artillery positions, and road junctions are supposed to be behind the edge of immediate violence. When those places are hit, the whole depth of the unit feels exposed. A wounded man waiting for evacuation may suddenly be in the fight again. A clerk may grab a carbine. A radio operator may find that transmitting messages matters less than surviving the next grenade. The war stops being arranged by job title. Everyone becomes infantry for a few minutes, or for the rest of the night. That too was part of the terror. A man could not tell himself, not my part of the line, not my road, not my job. Chinese infiltration and night assault made rear areas feel temporary. The enemy might not hold them for long, but he could appear there, disrupt them, kill men, burn vehicles, cut communications, and vanish or press onward. The psychological effect was enormous. Even when Chinese units did not destroy an entire position, they could force soldiers to spend the night in a state of complete alertness, firing at sounds, shifting reserves, checking wire, sending patrols, wondering which dark shape was a tree and which was a man. There is a human cost to that kind of vigilance. The body is not built to hold panic for hours and then simply reset. A night attack leaves residue. The next day, a soldier is not merely tired, he is scraped thin inside. He has used up something that does not return quickly. He may laugh too loudly. He may say nothing at all. He may clean his weapon with shaking hands and pretend they are shaking from cold. He may look at the ridge in daylight and feel ashamed that it frightened him so badly, even though the fear was reasonable. Then evening comes again, and the whole process begins to gather around him. This is why the first bugle mattered so much. Not because it was the loudest sound of the war, and not because it was the deadliest. It mattered because it taught American soldiers a new association. Bugle meant attack. Whistle meant movement. Sudden shouting in the hills meant the night was no longer passive. The sound entered memory. After Unsan, after Chongchon, after Chosin, after later battles in 1951 where bugles, whistles, bells and drums were again remembered by defenders, those sounds became part of the mental landscape of the Korean War. The National Museum of the United States Army preserves a Korean War bugle as a battlefield trophy and records a soldier's memory of midnight darkness broken by the eerie blare of a bugle beyond a trench. There is something very old inside that image. A modern war fought with aircraft, tanks, automatic weapons, radios, artillery and trucks, suddenly marked by a sound that could have belonged to another century. That contrast made it worse. The American soldier was standing in the middle of the 20th century, but the note coming from the dark felt older than machinery. It reached him directly without translation. Someone is coming. Let us not make the mistake, though, of thinking these attacks were only frightening because they were noisy. In many cases, the noise came after the most important work had already been done. The approach could be quiet. Chinese soldiers often moved carefully over ground that Americans considered difficult or impassable. They made use of draws, ridgelines, stream beds, and gaps between positions. They could close the distance before announcing the assault. The bugle was not necessarily the beginning of danger. It was the moment when hidden danger became visible enough to kill. That distinction matters for the man in the hole. If the bugle is the first thing he hears, then the enemy is already close. The warning and the attack arrive together. There is no comfortable interval. No long preparation, no time to be brave in a neat, practiced way. He must move now. He must decide now. He must fire at a shape now. The body reacts before the mind has finished understanding. Later, if he survives, he can explain it. At the time, he can only act. And still, many did act. This is important. Terror did not mean collapse in every case. Fear and courage are not opposites in war. They often occupy the same foxhole. American soldiers at Unsan fought back. Some held positions as long as they could. Some tried to reach trapped comrades. Elements of the 5th and 7th Cavalry attempted to break through to isolated men of the 8th Cavalry, and the 5th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel Harold K. Johnson, later Chief of Staff of the Army, led a counterattack against dug-in Chinese positions, but could not break through before daylight faded and withdrawal became necessary. That detail matters because panic alone does not explain Unsan. Surprise, terrain, numbers, infiltration, broken flanks, blocked roads, and misjudgment all mattered. But inside those larger causes were individual men doing what soldiers do under conditions they did not choose. Some stayed at guns until they could not. Some carried wounded. Some got lost. Some made decisions that saved others. Some made decisions that haunt any reader, because you know they were made in seconds, in darkness, with no good option. By the time small groups began trying to escape into the hills, the bugle had done its work. The men no longer needed to hear it to fear it. The sound was inside the night now. A man moving quietly through brush, separated from his unit, trying to avoid roadblocks, would listen for it in every pause. He might hear actual signals. He might hear imagined ones. He might hear his own blood in his ears and mistake it for something outside him. Cold makes sound strange. Fear makes it stranger. And Korea's hills did not offer easy mercy. Movement at night over mountain ground is slow even for men who are not exhausted. Add weapons, wounded friends, freezing temperatures, poor maps, enemy patrols, and the need to avoid roads, and every step becomes a negotiation. A man might fall behind and never be found. A group might choose the wrong draw and walk toward enemy positions. Someone might cough at the wrong time. Someone might drop equipment. Someone might be too wounded to keep moving, and the others would have to face a choice that no human being should have to face. Morning, when it came, didn't repair the world. It only revealed what had happened to it. The fields and roads around Unsan were no longer just places on a map. They were filled with abandoned guns, burned vehicles, scattered equipment, and the dead. Survivors came back in fragments. Men from different companies, men who had lost officers, men who could not account for friends. Reports had to be written. Casualties had to be counted. Headquarters had to understand what had happened, though understanding came slowly because the first explanations often tried to fit the disaster into old assumptions. Maybe the Chinese had attacked in limited numbers. Maybe it was a temporary intervention. Maybe they would withdraw. Maybe the war could continue north. But the men who had heard the bugles near Unsan knew something had changed, even if they could not yet name the full size of it. The first bugle in the darkness was not the last. It was a warning note, and like many warnings in history, it was understood clearly only after it had already been ignored. In the weeks that followed, Chinese attacks would strike larger formations, and the war that many had thought nearly finished would turn into a retreat through cold, confusion, and loss. Along the Chongchon River, American units would face attacks that found gaps and flanks. In the east, Marines and soldiers near the Chosun Reservoir would learn what it meant to fight surrounded in weather so cold that blood, weapons and hands seemed to freeze into the same hard reality. The sounds would return there too, in different valleys and against different men. But before all of that became famous, before Chosun became a name people still speak with respect, before the great withdrawals and the frozen roads and the later arguments over command decisions, there was Unsan, there was evening, there was a regiment that did not yet fully understand the army moving against it. There were hills that looked empty until they were not. There were bugles in the dying light, and grenades landing among surprised men, and a new kind of fear entering the American line. That fear would travel. It would move from survivor to replacement, from foxhole to mess line, from official report to whispered warning. It would become part of what men expected after sunset. The Chinese come at night. They blow bugles. They slip around the flank. They get behind you. They do not stop when you think they should stop. Some of that was accurate. Some of it grew in the telling. But fear does not require perfect accuracy to shape behaviour. It only needs enough truth to be believed. And there was enough truth. So now, as we leave Unsan's first shock behind us and move deeper into the pattern of these attacks, we need to ask the question that would have mattered to every man listening in a frozen position after dark. Why the night? Why did Chinese forces so often choose those hours when men were tired, sight was weak, and the world seemed least stable? The answer is not simple, and it is not only about fear. It is about survival under American air power. It is about terrain. It is about discipline, communication, surprise, and a way of fighting built from hard experience. It is about an army that had fewer machines but understood how to use darkness as cover, as weapon and as shield. The answer begins with daylight. That may sound backwards at first, because we are talking about night attacks, about bugles in the dark, about whistles and grenades, and men waiting in frozen foxholes while the hills ahead of them seem to breathe. But if you want to understand why Chinese forces chose the night again and again in Korea, you have to start with what daylight did to them. Daylight exposed them. Daylight punished them. Daylight belonged, more often than not, to the aircraft of the United Nations Command. A Chinese column moving openly by road in daylight could be seen, reported, attacked, and torn apart before it reached the battlefield. Trucks could be burned, supply animals could be killed. Men could be scattered across snow and rock by airstrikes. They had little ability to answer. The US Far East Air Forces made air superiority one of its central tasks in Korea, and that superiority shaped the choices available to the soldiers moving below it. So the Chinese chose the night because the night gave them a chance to survive long enough to fight. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the part that keeps the story grounded. The night was not chosen only because it frightened Americans, though it certainly did. It was chosen because it reduced the advantage of American aircraft. It reduced the advantage of long-range observation. It made it harder for artillery observers to see what was happening. It hid movement from men on hilltops and from pilots overhead. It turned a battlefield dominated by machines into a battlefield where feet, lungs, discipline and memory mattered again. This is one reason old descriptions of Chinese attacks as nothing more than human waves are misleading. That phrase has been used so many times that it can feel like explanation, but often it explains very little. It suggests mindless numbers. It suggests soldiers pushed forward without skill or planning. The reality was more difficult and more disturbing. Chinese troops did sometimes attack in large numbers, and they did sometimes accept losses that shocked American soldiers. But the goal was usually not simply to run straight into fire and hope enough men survived. The goal was to get close without being seen, find weak points, strike flanks and rear areas, cut roads, isolate small units, and make a stronger enemy fight at a distance where his strongest weapons could not be used as easily. When the US Army's official history describes Chinese forces along the Chongchon River in November 1950, it notes that they found gaps between American units, struck their flanks, and used infiltrators behind the line, which is a very different thing from an undirected rush. Think of what that meant in practical terms. An American unit sitting on a hill in Korea might look strong if you saw it on a map. There was a line, there were companies, there were battalions, there were artillery units somewhere behind them, radios connecting commanders, trucks on roads bringing ammunition and food. But the map did not show every gully. It did not show every fold in the terrain. It did not show the narrow spaces between units, where one company's responsibility ended and another's began. It did not show the small paths locals used, the frozen stream beds, the scrub-covered slopes, the ridges that could be crossed by men willing to climb all night in silence. The Chinese looked for those spaces. They used the land not as scenery, but as a tool. Korea made this possible. The country was not a broad, open battlefield where every movement could be seen from far away. Much of the fighting happened in rugged country broken by mountains, valleys, ridgelines and narrow roads. Roads mattered enormously to American forces because trucks, artillery, tanks, ambulances, fuel, food and ammunition all needed them. A road was not just a road, it was the artery of a unit. Cut it, and the position at the front began to weaken even before the men in the foxholes understood why. Chinese forces, often moving on foot, could travel across country that was painful and exhausting but not impossible. They could climb where trucks could not go. They could appear on high ground overlooking a road and turn a withdrawal into a gauntlet. This is exactly what happened after the Chinese breakthrough along the Chongchon. The army history describes Chinese roadblocks being set up to the rear of units, and later the US 2nd Infantry Division's withdrawal route south from Kunuri became trapped under fire from Chinese positions on the high ground, with vehicles clogged on a valley road and men forced to continue on foot. A road that had been a supply route became a killing zone. That was not accidental. It was the result of an approach that treated the night, the hills, and the American dependence on road movement as parts of the same problem. Now, let's look at this from the Chinese side, not to excuse anything or make the night attacks less frightening, but to understand why they made sense to the commanders ordering them. The People's Volunteer Army entered Korea with serious disadvantages. It had limited armour. It lacked the kind of air support United Nations forces could call upon. It had much less heavy artillery. It had shortages of radios, vehicles, winter clothing, medical supplies, and food. Some Chinese soldiers carried rifles that had already passed through other wars. Many units depended on porters, pack animals, and human backs for supplies. If they tried to fight the American army in the open, in daylight, at long range, trading shell for shell and tank for tank, they would be fighting on American terms. That was not a battle they were likely to win. So they changed the terms. They moved at night. They hid during the day. They approached silently when they could. They attacked when aircraft were less useful and when defenders were tired. They tried to close the distance before American artillery and mortars could fully break up the attack. They used whistles, bugles, drums, gongs, and shouted signals because they could not always rely on radios, and because sound carried where wires and batteries failed. To the American soldier, those signals sounded strange and terrifying. To the Chinese unit commander, they were also practical. They told men when to move, when to shift, when to press, when to stop, when to redirect. The sound became part of the method. There is something almost cruelly logical about it. If you lack machines, you use timing. If you lack air power, you use darkness. If you lack radios, you use sound. If you lack trucks, you use legs. If you lack the ability to destroy an enemy position from far away, you get close enough to fight with grenades, small arms, and bodies in the same trench. This is not mystery. It is adaptation under pressure. The Chinese soldiers who entered Korea had also inherited experience from earlier wars. Many had fought in the Chinese Civil War. Some had experience from the long struggle against Japan. The Chinese Communist forces had developed habits of movement, camouflage, infiltration, and night fighting over years of operating against enemies with different advantages. They knew how to march hard. They knew how to live with little. They knew how to make local superiority matter. Local superiority is an important phrase here. It means you do not need to be stronger everywhere. You need to be stronger at the specific point you choose to attack, at the specific hour you choose to attack it. A platoon, a company, or a battalion can be overwhelmed if enough men get close enough at the right moment, even if the larger army behind that position is better supplied and better equipped. For the American soldier in the foxhole, that distinction did not help much. If hundreds of enemy soldiers were coming at his position, it did not matter that the Chinese army as a whole lacked tanks or heavy artillery. At that moment, on that slope, in that darkness, the Chinese were strong where he was weak. They had chosen the place carefully enough, and they had chosen the hour carefully enough, that the balance of power felt reversed. This is one of the most unsettling lessons of Korea. A modern army can be very powerful and still be vulnerable at night on the wrong hill. It can have aircraft and tanks and artillery, and still find that none of those things are immediately useful when enemy soldiers are already inside grenade range. It can have radios and command structures and still lose track of what is happening when lines are broken, flares are burning out, and men are shouting contradictory reports from different sides of the perimeter. The night also changed the American soldier's body. That may sound too simple, but it matters. Men were tired after a day of movement, digging, patrols, and cold. In Korea, especially in late 1950, cold was not background discomfort. It was an enemy of its own. It slowed hands. It drained attention. It made weapons harder to handle. It turned sleeping into a survival task. Men who should have been recovering after sunset instead had to stand watch, listen, and wait. The Chinese understood that the hours after dark were when the defender's body wanted to shut down. Attacking then meant striking not only a position but a nervous system. A night attack also made American fire discipline harder. In daylight, a man could often aim at a visible target. At night, he might fire at movement, at muzzle flashes, at sound, at the outline of a body seen for half a second under a flare. Ammunition could be burned quickly. Machine guns could fire into darkness because not firing felt more dangerous. Mortar and artillery calls became harder when units were unsure of the enemy's exact location, or when infiltrators had gotten close enough that calling fire risked hitting friendly positions. This confusion was not incidental. It was one of the reasons the method worked. There is a small but important point here about fear. The Chinese did not need every American to break. They only needed enough confusion at enough points to open the line. One roadblock behind a unit could cause disproportionate trouble. One platoon position overrun could expose another. One mistaken report could pull reserves the wrong way. One command post hit by infiltrators could delay orders at precisely the wrong time. At night, small disruptions became larger because commanders could not easily see the whole situation. Darkness magnified every mistake. At the Chongchon, Chinese attacks did not simply hit the front and stop. They came against flanks, rear areas, and withdrawal routes. When the ROK-2 Corps front broke, the right flank of 8th Army was exposed, and the Chinese pushed forces through the gap while threatening to envelop the whole army. The official army account says that by the afternoon of November 28th, US and South Korean units were in retreat, with the 2nd Infantry Division badly endangered and the wider force trying to avoid being wrapped from the east. That is the strategic version of the same fear a private felt in his hole. They are not just in front of us anymore. In the east, around the Shozhen Reservoir, the same basic realities appeared in harsher form. The battlefield there was remote, mountainous, and brutally cold. The Marine Corps history of Chosun describes a 2-week fight in which roughly 30,000 US, South Korean, and British troops faced a much larger Chinese force in severe winter conditions. In such country, movement was difficult for everyone, but Chinese night movement could allow units to surround, isolate, or block elements of the United Nations force before daylight clarified what had happened. Positions that seemed connected by roads and plans became isolated islands after dark. The Chinese chose the night because night helped them get close, and getting close was essential. A rifleman with limited ammunition cannot win a long-distance fire duel against a position backed by artillery. A force without air support cannot comfortably assemble in daylight under enemy observation. A unit without many radios cannot depend on the kind of flexible command system American units tried to use. But if that same force can approach within grenade range, if it can enter the trenches, if it can force hand-to-hand fighting, if it can make the battle happen inside the perimeter rather than outside it, then many of those disadvantages shrink. This is why American veterans remembered Chinese attacks as intimate and chaotic. The enemy was not always a distant line. He could be at the wire in the foxhole next to yours, behind the command post, on the road you needed to use, or on the hill you thought belonged to another company. War at close range is not only deadlier in the immediate sense, it is psychologically different. It removes the protective distance that lets men think of the enemy as a target. It forces recognition. A man hears breathing. He sees a face for a second in flare light. He feels dirt thrown by a grenade close enough to bury itself in the wall of his hole. The night made that closeness possible. There was also a rhythm to Chinese operations that Americans had to learn through bitter experience. Chinese forces might attack at night, pull back or hide before daylight, then strike again later. They might leave a position quiet for hours, even a day, and then return. They might use a first attack to find weak points and a later attack to exploit them. They might attack just before dawn, when defenders were exhausted from staying alert all night, and when relief seemed close enough to tempt the mind into relaxing. The army account of the Chongchon fighting notes that Chinese attacks forced US soldiers onto the defensive, digging in and waiting for renewed assaults after the first night's action. That waiting was itself part of the damage. Now, imagine being an American officer trying to prepare for this. You know the Chinese prefer darkness. You tell your men to expect it. You set listening posts. You place machine guns. You arrange fields of fire. You call for flares and register artillery. You tell everyone to stay awake. But the night is long, and men are human. Someone gets cold. Someone nods off for a second. Someone hears movement but cannot tell whether it is a patrol coming back. Someone fires too early and gives away a position. Someone waits too long and the enemy reaches the wire. Even good preparation could not remove the strain. It could only improve the odds. This is where the Chinese choice of night becomes more than a tactical preference. It became a psychological campaign, whether or not every Chinese commander thought of it in those terms. It forced American units to spend every evening preparing for the worst. It made darkness feel occupied. It turned normal sounds into warnings. It made sleep dangerous. It made the last hour of daylight feel like a countdown. Men checked ammunition not as routine, but as a kind of ritual against what might come. They looked toward hills that had been quiet all afternoon and wondered what was hidden there. The terror was not only in the assault, it was in the expectation of assault. There is a temptation to imagine that fear belongs to the side being attacked, and confidence belongs to the side attacking. Real war is not so clean. Chinese soldiers also had reason to fear the night. Night movement over Korean mountains was exhausting and dangerous. A man could lose his unit, fall, freeze, or arrive too late. Units could become disorganized before the attack began. They often carried limited supplies. If they failed to take a position quickly, daylight could expose them to air attack and artillery. Their commanders knew this. That is why many attacks had to be sharp, close, and urgent. Success before dawn mattered. The night protected them, but only for a time. The limitations of night attacks became clearer as the war continued. Once American and United Nations forces adjusted, they improved defensive perimeters, used more illumination, coordinated artillery more carefully, and learned to expect infiltration. Commanders such as Matthew Ridgway, who took over 8th Army after General Walton Walker's death, placed greater emphasis on firm defensive positions, artillery, patrols, and controlled withdrawals rather than overextended advances. Chinese night tactics remained dangerous, but they were no longer as surprising as they had been in late 1950. Surprise is a weapon that weakens with use, though it never disappears entirely. Still, the memory of those first months remained. The Chinese had shown that they could take the most advanced army in the world's most powerful coalition and make its soldiers feel blind. They had shown that the absence of tanks and aircraft did not mean helplessness. They had shown that a man on foot moving silently through mountains at night could change the fate of a division if enough others moved with him. They had shown that the battlefield did not belong automatically to the side with more machines. It belonged, hour by hour, to the side that best understood what that hour allowed, and night allowed a great deal. It allowed an army to march unseen. It allowed men to cross ridges that aircraft might have watched in daylight. It allowed small groups to slip into gaps. It allowed bugles and whistles to carry instructions across broken ground. It allowed attackers to close the range and make American artillery less certain. It allowed roadblocks to appear where roads had been safe. It allowed rumours to become believable. It allowed fear to spread faster than information. This is why, when American soldiers heard that the Chinese came at night, it was not just a battlefield detail. It was a warning about the whole shape of their existence in Korea. The day might be used to repair, count, evacuate, dig, and wait. But the night had to be endured. The night was when the hills could fill with men. The night was when a quiet slope could become a route of assault. The night was when a bugle could turn every head in a company at once. So the Chinese chose the night because it was cover, because it was protection, because it was communication, because it was surprise, because it narrowed the gap between a poorly equipped infantryman and a heavily armed modern force. They chose it because daylight was too costly, because the terrain rewarded patience, because roads were vulnerable, because American units were often stretched thin, and because fear itself became useful once the pattern was established. There is no single reason that explains it all. There is a chain of reasons, each linked to the next, until the choice becomes almost unavoidable. and once that choice was made, the men on both sides had to live inside it. Chinese soldiers spent the daylight hours hidden, hungry, cold, and waiting for orders to move. American soldiers spent those same hours looking at the hills, trying to guess where the enemy had gone. Then evening came down over the ridges. The light faded from the valleys first. Men pulled scarves higher, checked grenades, stamped their feet against the cold, and listened. The reasons for the night attack were practical, but the experience of waiting for it was not practical at all. It was personal. It was physical. It sat in the stomach and tightened the hands around a rifle. And in Korea, where the hills were frozen, the lines were thin, and sleep became something men took in fragments, that waiting could wear a soldier down before the first whistle ever sounded. By the time the cold settled over the hills, the men had already learned not to trust the quiet. That was one of the small lessons Korea taught quickly and without mercy. Quiet did not mean no one was there. Quiet did not mean the enemy had gone. Quiet might only mean that somewhere beyond the ridge, men were lying still under brush or snow, waiting for the light to fail. The American soldier in late 1950 had to carry that knowledge through every hour of darkness, and it changed the way he stood, the way he listened, the way he slept, if sleep came at all. A man can be brave in daylight and still find that his courage feels thinner at 2 a.m, when his hands are numb, his feet are aching inside frozen boots, and the hillside in front of him has become a wall of black shapes that will not stay still. The Korean winter was not simply cold. Cold is too small a word for what the men around the Chosun Reservoir and along the northern roads experienced. It was a physical pressure, a constant occupation of the body. In November 1950, a cold front from Siberia moved down over the Chosun Reservoir area, and accounts from US military sources describe temperatures dropping as low as 36 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. That number is easy to read and difficult to understand. 36 below 0 is not the kind of temperature most people can imagine from comfort. It is not a sharper version of a normal winter morning. It changes the rules of the body. Skin exposed too long can freeze. Breath becomes vapour that hangs around faces and collars. Canteens freeze. Rations freeze. Oil thickens. Weapons become stubborn. Metal seems hostile. A man who sweats during a climb may find that sweat turning dangerous when he stops moving. Cold at that level does not merely surround you. It enters every decision. Think about a foxhole in those conditions. We use the word foxhole so casually in war stories that it begins to sound like a prepared space, almost a small room in the earth. In Korea in winter, digging one could be a fight by itself. The ground was often frozen hard. Picks struck earth that behaved like stone. Men scraped, chopped, cursed, and dug what they could, because even a shallow hole was better than no cover at all. Sometimes a position was a hole. Sometimes it was a scrape. Sometimes it was a place behind a rock, a road embankment, a frozen wall, a stack of whatever could stop a bullet. The men did not have the luxury of perfect defences. They had the ground available to them, and the ground was not generous. Now imagine being told to sleep there. Not sleep in the ordinary sense, not undress, not settle in, not let the mind go fully soft. Sleep as soldiers sleep when danger is close. One man watches while another rests, or half the position stays awake while the other half takes whatever sleep it can. At Fox Company's position near Toktong Pass during the Chosun fighting, a later account describes men in a perimeter with some Marines sleeping in heavy bags, while others kept watch, unable to light fires because doing so would reveal their position. That small detail, no fires, tells you almost everything. The thing the body most wanted was heat. The thing survival required was concealment. So men lay in frozen holes without flame, listening for movement, knowing that warmth could become a signal to the enemy. This is the kind of choice war makes ordinary. Warmth or concealment, sleep or readiness, stay still and freeze slowly, or move and risk being seen. A man might pull a sleeping bag around himself and still keep a rifle close enough to grab without thinking. He might sleep with boots on, gear half fastened, ammunition near his hands. He might wake not because someone shook him, but because something in the darkness had changed. A sound, a silence, the beginning of a shout. The first note of a bugle. There are veterans of many wars who say that after enough nights in danger, the body learns to wake before the mind knows why. Korea gave men many chances to learn that. The lines themselves were often thin, and this thinness mattered. On a map, a front can look solid. It can be drawn in a firm line with arrows and symbols and unit names. On the ground, especially in Korean mountains, that line might be a series of separated positions on ridges and hilltops, connected by roads or trails that were difficult even in daylight. Between those positions there were gaps, and gaps are invitations. The US Army's official history of the Chinese intervention describes Chinese forces during the November 1950 fighting along the Chongchon River, finding gaps between American units and striking their flanks, which is exactly the kind of thing that turns a line into a collection of isolated groups. The phrase sounds technical, the experience was not. For the men in those positions, it meant the enemy might not come from where the machine gun was pointed. It meant the left and right edges of the world were uncertain. It meant that one company's nightmare could begin in the empty space between itself and the next unit. There is a special loneliness in being part of a line that does not feel like a line. You may know that other Americans are somewhere nearby, on another hill, down the road, across the valley, behind you with artillery or vehicles, but at night, if you cannot see them and cannot easily reach them, their existence becomes more like a promise than a fact. Radios might work or they might not. Batteries suffered in the cold, wires could be cut, runners could get lost or killed, orders could arrive late if they arrived at all. A man in a foxhole has very little use for the idea of a division if the enemy is 20 yards away and the next friendly position feels like another country. This was one reason Chinese night attacks were so effective against the nerves. They did not merely threaten the body, they threatened connection. They made a man wonder whether he was still part of a larger formation, or whether his small hole in the ground had become the whole war. A soldier could hear firing from another ridge, and not know whether it meant help was close, or disaster was spreading. He could see flares rising somewhere beyond him, and wonder whose perimeter was being hit. He could hear shouting and not know whether the voices belonged to his own men, enemy troops, wounded soldiers, or all three tangled together. In darkness, information arrived as fragments, and fear rushed to fill the gaps. The cold made those fragments harder to manage. It is one thing to wait in a well-rested body. It is another to wait after days of marching, fighting, digging, carrying ammunition, helping wounded men, eating too little, and sleeping in pieces. Exhaustion changes judgment. It makes time stretch. It makes ordinary tasks take effort. A tired man can stare at the same patch of brush for minutes and begin to believe he has seen it move. He can hear a stone slide and feel his heart slam against his ribs. He can forget whether he checked his rifle 10 minutes ago or an hour ago. He can snap at a friend and then apologise without quite knowing why. Sleep deprivation does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a man doing everything correctly, only slower, with less room inside him for fear. And there was always fear. Not constant screaming fear. That is not how most men function in prolonged danger. It was more often a low, steady pressure under the ribs. During the day, work could distract from it. Men repaired positions, redistributed ammunition, cleaned weapons, carried messages, searched for supplies, tried to warm food, checked wounded friends, and stared at the hills. The day had tasks. The evening took those tasks and narrowed them into waiting. Once the sun dropped, the question returned. Would they come tonight? It is hard to explain how heavy that question becomes when it has been answered yes before. A single night attack could teach a man to dread every following sunset. The first time, he might not know what the sounds mean. The second time, he knows too well. A whistle in the distance is no longer just a whistle. It is the memory of grenades. A bugle is no longer a strange instrument. It is the beginning of bodies moving through the dark. Even silence becomes full of possibilities. This is how the Chinese method extended beyond the moments of actual combat. It made the hours before combat part of the battle. The cold also changed weapons. Men had to keep rifles and automatic weapons functioning in weather that wanted to stop everything mechanical. Lubricants could thicken, parts could freeze, condensation could become ice. A weapon that worked perfectly in training might become unreliable if not cared for constantly. Soldiers learned to protect bolts and chambers, to keep weapons as dry as possible, to sleep with them near the body when they could, to treat a rifle not as an object but as a companion whose failure might mean death. The cold entered the trigger guard. It made bare fingers clumsy. Gloves protected the hand but dulled the touch. In a night attack, when seconds mattered, even a stiff safety or a frozen magazine could become a personal catastrophe. Then there were the wounded. Cold is cruel to the wounded in ways that are difficult to sit with for long. A man hit during a night attack might lie where he fell until the firing eased enough for someone to reach him. Blood loss, shock, and freezing temperatures worked together. A wound that might be survivable under better conditions became more dangerous if evacuation was delayed. Medics moved through darkness under fire, carrying aid kits stiff with cold, trying to identify who was calling, who could be saved first, who needed a litter, who could still walk. The wounded themselves often had to wait in holes, ditches, or aid stations where warmth was limited and evacuation routes were uncertain. A man listening to a friend call out from the dark might be more frightened by helplessness than by the enemy. At Chosin, the scale of hardship became almost impossible to separate from the fighting itself. Marine Corps accounts describe the Battle of Chosin Reservoir as a 2-week battle in which roughly 30,000 US, South Korean and British troops faced about 120,000 Chinese troops in severe winter conditions. Numbers like that can make the scene feel distant, so bring it down again. 1 Marine in one hole, 1 Army soldier on one road, 1 machine gun crew trying to keep a weapon working, 1 corpsman or medic moving from man to man. 1 cook, driver, clerk, radio operator or artilleryman suddenly forced to become a rifleman because the perimeter has no respect for job descriptions. Every large number in history is made of small human knights. The thinness of the lines was partly a result of terrain, and partly a result of overconfidence earlier in the campaign. United Nations forces had advanced deep into North Korea after the Incheon landing, and the collapse of much North Korean resistance. They were stretched across difficult country, with command separated in the west and east, roads strained by distance, and units pushing toward objectives near the Yalu. The hope that the war might end soon had not prepared men for a massive Chinese intervention. When the intervention came in force, many positions were not arranged for a slow, stable defence. They were exposed, extended, and sometimes poorly connected. This did not mean the men were not brave. It meant bravery had to operate inside a bad geometry. Bad geometry is a useful way to think about it. A hill position can be strong in one direction and weak in another. A road can connect units until it is blocked. A valley can shelter a supply column until high ground on both sides belongs to the enemy. A defensive perimeter can hold until one corner folds, and then every other corner must suddenly understand a new situation. Chinese night attacks exploited that geometry. They did not need to make every American position collapse at once. They needed to bend one part, cut one road, isolate one company, create enough confusion that larger strength could not be used in time. For the men trying to sleep, this meant safety felt temporary. A soldier might be told that his company was in reserve, only to find that the enemy had bypassed the front. A driver might think his danger was on the road ahead, then hear firing from the slope above him. A wounded man might believe he had reached the rear, then hear bugles again. The night blurred categories. Front and rear, safe and unsafe, rest and combat, all of them became unstable. There is another detail worth sitting with. In ordinary life, sleep is private. It is when a person lets go of control. In Korea, sleep became public, rationed, and dangerous. Men slept beside other men, in holes, in trucks, beside roads, under ponchos, in sleeping bags stiff with frost, or not at all. They slept in clothing soaked with sweat and frozen by wind. They slept with boots on because taking boots off could mean not getting them back on, or because an attack might come before they could lace them. They slept while artillery sounded in the distance. They slept after seeing things no one should see. Then they were awakened, and they had to fight immediately with dreams still clinging to them. What does that do to the mind? It makes the border between waking and alarm very thin. A man might wake and reach for his weapon before knowing where he is. He might dream of bugles and then hear real whistles. He might spend a night awake and then, in daylight, find himself losing seconds without meaning to, head dropping, body stealing sleep wherever it can. Commanders could order vigilance, but no order abolishes human limits. The body collects its debts. And yet men stayed. That is not a slogan. It is a fact worth honouring carefully. They stayed in positions that were cold, exposed, and frightening. They watched while others slept. They cleaned weapons with stiff fingers. They carried ammunition up hills. They held fire until shapes became clear enough to shoot. They fired into darkness when waiting longer would be worse. They dragged wounded men through snow and mud. They argued, cursed, prayed, joked, shook, and kept going. Courage in those nights was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was simply staying awake for another hour because your friend was asleep beside you and someone had to listen. The Chinese soldiers across the hills were enduring their own version of the night. Many were also freezing. Many had marched for hours with little food. Some had poor footwear and light clothing. They had to move quietly through terrain that could kill them even before the Americans fired. They had to close on positions defended by automatic weapons, grenades, mortars, and artillery. They had to trust signals in darkness and press forward while men fell around them. Understanding this does not reduce the terror felt by US troops. It deepens the tragedy. The Korean night was full of frightened men on both sides, each told that survival required the other side to break first. But from the American foxhole, the enemy's hardship was usually invisible. What was visible was the result. A ridge that had seemed empty could suddenly fill with movement. A road could be blocked. A hilltop could be surrounded. A company could spend the night beating back attacks and then discover in the morning that the neighbouring unit had withdrawn or been overrun. The official histories give us the sequence. The men lived the confusion. A few hours before an expected attack may have been the hardest time of all. Supper, if there was supper, was practical and rushed. Frozen rations had to be warmed if possible. Coffee, when available, mattered more than taste. Cigarettes glowed briefly and had to be cupped carefully. Men checked ammunition again. Grenades were placed where hands could find them. Machine gun belts were arranged. Mortar crews prepared rounds. Listening posts went forward, which meant a few men moved out beyond the relative safety of the main position, into the darker space where the enemy might already be. The rest waited for those men to hear something, or not come back. There is no comfort in that kind of waiting. It is not restful even when nothing happens. If no attack comes, the men have still spent the night in readiness, muscles tight, sleep broken, imagination active. If the attack does come, then all that waiting collapses into action, and afterward the body is even more empty than before. Either way, the night takes something. This is why the phrase "men who could not sleep" is more than a description of insomnia. It describes a condition of the war itself. Sleep was stolen by cold, by fear, by duty, by the expectation of bugles, by the possibility of infiltration, by the sound of distant fighting, by the knowledge that a mistake made while drowsy could kill friends. The soldiers did not merely lack sleep. They were denied the feeling that sleep was safe. The hills made it worse because they held sound strangely. A bugle could seem to come from one direction and then echo from another, Gunfire could bounce against slopes. Shouts could rise from valleys and lose their location. Flares could illuminate one patch of ground while leaving another blacker than before. Snow could muffle movement in one place, and crusted ice could betray it in another. The landscape did not behave like a flat training field. It confused the senses, and the Chinese used that confusion whenever they could. By midnight, a position might have settled into a pattern that was not peace, but endurance. Men at the perimeter stared outward. Men off watch tried to rest. Somewhere a wounded man murmured or slept under blankets. Somewhere a radio operator listened through static. Somewhere an officer walked the line quietly, telling men to stay alert, asking about ammunition, pretending more confidence than he felt because confidence is part of his job. The cold pressed down. The stars, when the sky was clear, looked hard and close. The dark hills stood around them like walls. Then, perhaps, nothing happened. That sounds like mercy, and in some ways it was. No bugles, no grenades. No sudden rush on the wire, no shouting from the slope. But even a quiet night did not fully belong to the men. It was spent waiting for violence that might arrive tomorrow instead. Morning would come grey and cold. Men would climb out stiffly, stamp life back into their feet, check weapons, count supplies, and look toward the ridges. They might laugh at themselves a little for what they imagined in the dark. They might not laugh at all. They might hear that another unit was hit 10 miles away, or that patrols found tracks, or that prisoners said another attack was coming. The day would begin, but it would not release them from the night behind it. And if the attack did come, the first sounds could erase every thought except the immediate ones. Get up. Grab the rifle. Where are they? Wake him. More ammunition. Fire lower. Watch the left. Grenades. Medic. The cold disappeared for a few minutes, not because it was gone, but because fear burned hotter. Men who had been shivering became suddenly alert. Muzzle flashes cut the darkness. Flares rose. Shadows moved. The thin line became a living thing, bending and straining, held together by individual men who could not see the whole of it, and had to trust that others were doing the same somewhere beyond the next rock. That is where the story of these nights has to stay for a while. Not in headquarters first, not in the broad arrows across maps, in the holes and scrapes and frozen ridgelines where the war was reduced to listening. Because before any Chinese assault reached the wire, before a grenade landed, before a position was overrun or held, there was always the sound that came before the attack. Sometimes a bugle, sometimes a whistle, sometimes the faintest movement in the dark. And for the men who had gone too many nights without real sleep, that sound could be enough to make the whole hillside seem alive. There is a moment before a night attack when nothing has technically happened yet, and still every man knows the night has changed. No bullet has struck the parapet. No grenade has rolled into the hole. No body has appeared at the wire. But something moves through the dark, and the body understands it before the mind finishes naming it. A note from a bugle, a whistle rising and falling somewhere below the ridge. A sudden shout carried strangely by the cold air. Maybe bells, maybe cymbals. Maybe the crackle of small arms far enough away that men cannot tell whether it is beginning on their flank or on someone else's line. The sound itself is not large at first. It is not the heaviest thing in the battle. But it is the first thing that tells the waiting soldier that the attack is no longer possible. It is happening. That is what made the sounds before Chinese night attack so difficult for American soldiers to forget. They were not simply noises. They were warnings, commands, and memories all at once. Once a man had survived one of those nights, a bugle was no longer an instrument. A whistle was no longer an ordinary sharp sound. The smallest call from the hills could carry the weight of everything that had followed the last time he heard it. Gunfire might kill him, but the bugle announced the attempt. It crossed the distance first. It reached the foxhole before the attackers did. The official accounts of the Korean War record these sounds again and again in a way that is easy to pass over if you read too quickly. Along the Chongchon River on the night of November 25, 1950, The US Army Center of Military History describes Chinese troops charging to the sounds of bugles, finding gaps between American units and striking their flanks. That sentence contains an entire world of fear if you slow down enough to enter it. It means men did not merely hear an attack from one direction. They heard signals in the dark while the line around them was already being found, tested and broken in places they could not see. To understand why sound mattered so much, you have to remember what the night took away. It took away distance. It took away certainty. It took away the clear outline of the ground. In daylight, a soldier could point and say the enemy is there, or the ridge is there, or the road bends there, or our left flank begins at that draw. At night, especially in the Korean hills, those statements became less stable. The same slope a man had watched all afternoon became a black mass. A gully disappeared. Trees leaned into strange shapes. The air seemed to carry sound from impossible directions. A shout from one hill might echo from another. A burst of fire could sound close and far at the same time. The soldier did not only hear the battlefield, he had to interpret it, and interpretation under fear is a dangerous business. Imagine a listening post just forward of the main line. 2 or 3 men are lying still in the dark, farther out than anyone wants to be, placed there because someone has to give warning before the enemy reaches the perimeter. They are not comfortable. They are not relaxed. They are trying to become part of the ground. They know the friendly line is behind them, but behind them is not close enough to feel safe. Ahead of them is a slope, a draw, maybe brush, maybe snow, maybe rocks that catch a little starlight and then lose it. Their job is to hear what others cannot hear yet. That sounds simple until you think about how much the night contains. Wind, frozen grass shifting, loose stones, their own breathing, the creak of web gear when one of them moves a shoulder, a cough they try to swallow, the beating of blood in their ears. Then, somewhere out there, a whistle. Not loud, not yet. Just a short sound, so human and deliberate that it seems to cut through everything else. The men at the listening post hold still. One of them may wonder whether he imagined it. Another may already be reaching for the field phone or preparing to crawl back. They wait for confirmation, because no one wants to start a false alarm and no one wants to wait too long. Then a second sound comes from another direction. A bugle, perhaps. A voice. A faint clatter, metal against metal, or the dull thump of men moving carefully over frozen ground. At that point the night is no longer empty. It has organisation inside it. This was one of the reasons the sound before the attack frightened men so deeply. It revealed organisation. Random noise can be dismissed for a little while. A falling branch can be explained. A rock can roll on its own, but a bugle is not random. A whistle repeated in a pattern is not random. Bells and horns sounding from several points along a ridge are not random. They tell you that someone is coordinating movement out there. They tell you that the enemy is not lost in the dark. He may know exactly where he is, and that means he may know exactly where you are. For Chinese units, these sounds served practical purposes. Radios were scarce, batteries could fail, wires could be broken, and the terrain made modern communication difficult. Bugles, whistles, horns, and shouted commands allowed leaders to pass signals across ridges and through broken ground. At Chipyong-ni in February 1951, the US Army Heritage and Education Center notes that Americans could hear Chinese troops in the darkness using horns and whistles to coordinate attacks, and that some Chinese advanced close to the barbed wire around American positions. What sounded to an American private like something from a nightmare was also, in a very plain military sense, a communication system. But practical things can still terrify. That is one of the recurring truths of war. A flare is practical. It lights the battlefield. It also shows a man what is coming. A bugle is practical. It signals troops. It also tells the defender that men are moving toward him. A whistle is practical. It can shift a unit or launch a rush. It also turns darkness into intention. The Americans did not need to know the exact meaning of each sound for the sounds to work on them. In fact, not knowing made it worse. Did that note mean advance? Did it mean retreat? Did it mean shift left? Did it mean another wave was coming? Did it mean the attack had begun somewhere else and would reach them next? The uncertainty allowed imagination to enlarge the danger, and imagination at night is not a small thing. A soldier who had been in Korea long enough to expect Chinese attacks after dark might spend hours constructing the battle before it began. He might hear a bugle and immediately picture men rising from a draw. He might hear whistles and picture grenades already in the air. He might hear bells and imagine units massing beyond the ridge. Some of those thoughts would be accurate, some would not. The body did not wait to verify. The heart sped up. Hands tightened on the rifle. Men whispered down the line. Someone woke the man beside him. Someone checked the machine gun belt again. Someone called back for flares. The sound did work before the attackers reached killing distance. This is why the first few sounds could be more frightening than the first few shots. Gunfire gave a man something to do. Fire back, get lower, shift position, pass ammunition, call for mortar fire. Once the fight began, terror had to share space with action. Before the fight, terror had the room to itself. The bugle created that terrible little gap between knowing and doing, between warning and contact, between the night as it had been and the night as it was about to become. That gap might last 10 seconds. It might last a minute. It might last longer if the Chinese were signalling and moving into final positions. For the men waiting, it could feel much longer than it was. At Chosin, these sounds became part of the memory of the battle. A Marine Corps account describes Chinese night attacks with bugles, whistles, and cymbals sounding as troops came against American positions in the bitter cold. The detail is so vivid that it almost risks becoming theatrical in the modern imagination, but the reality was not theatrical for the men hearing it. They were not sitting in a safe place being impressed by atmosphere. They were cold, sleep-starved, and often isolated. Many had spent the daylight hours expecting another attack. When the sounds began, they were hearing confirmation that the night would again demand more than they thought they had left. Let us sit inside that position for a moment. It is late. The fire discipline has been repeated. Do not fire too soon. Wait until you have a target. Watch the left. Watch the wire. Pass the word quietly. The men have tried to eat something, if something could be thawed enough to eat. Coffee, if they have it, has become less a drink than a medicine against exhaustion. Cigarettes are cupped in gloved hands or not lit at all. The ground is hard. The cold has made everyone older. The sky is dark and clear, or low and clouded, and the hills ahead are not hills anymore but dark walls with places in them where men might be hidden. Then a flare goes up from somewhere down the line. The whole world changes for a few seconds. Snow or frost reflects the light. Rocks sharpen, wire glints. A tree becomes a tree again. The men scan fast because flare light does not last. Maybe they see nothing. Maybe that is worse. The flare sinks or burns out, and the darkness returns thicker than before. Then comes the whistle. Then another. Then the bugle. Someone says, "Here they come." Someone else says nothing because he's already seen movement. The sound before the attack did not always come as one dramatic signal. Sometimes it built. A few whistles first, then quiet, then shouts, then a burst of mortar fire, then bugles. Sometimes grenades came first, landing out of the dark before the defenders had located the attackers. Sometimes small arms opened from one side to draw attention, while another group moved closer. Sometimes the noise seemed designed to overwhelm the senses, with signals, battle cries, and firing coming together so that men could not tell command from chaos. At Chipyong-ni, accounts describe bugles, whistles, bells, and battle cries preceding attacks along the perimeter around midnight, with heavy pressure falling on several sectors. A perimeter under that kind of sound does not feel like a clean circle. It feels like a room with every wall being struck at once. The bells are a detail that deserves a little attention. Bugles and whistles make immediate sense as signals. Bells and symbols feel stranger to a modern reader, but on a noisy battlefield they could cut through in a different way. Metal carries. A clanging sound can be heard above shouting and small arms. Whether used for signalling, intimidation, rhythm, or a mixture of all three, it added to the American impression that the attack was not merely being launched, but announced. This was one of the things that unsettled men. The Chinese did not always come silently. Sometimes they came with a storm of sound that seemed to declare numbers, confidence, and nearness before any individual attacker was visible. There was a practical reason for that too. Silence is useful during the approach, but once the assault begins, especially across uneven ground at night, units can lose cohesion quickly. Men drift, groups bunch up, some move too fast, others fall behind. A commander who cannot speak to every squad by radio needs signals that can be recognized under stress. A bugle call or whistle blast can impose shape on movement. It can tell men to surge forward. It can help separate one phase from another. It can rally men who have gone to ground. To the attackers, sound was a tool against disorder. To the defenders, it sounded like disorder made dangerous. This double meaning is important. The same sound that gave Chinese troops coordination gave American troops dread. The same signal that helped an assault keep moving told the defender that more men were coming. The same bugle that might have told one Chinese unit to advance might have told an American soldier that his last quiet second had passed. And the Americans listened differently after each attack. The first time a man heard the bugles, he might have been confused. The second time, he was conditioned. The sound had acquired history. This is how fear becomes efficient. It no longer has to explain itself. It arrives with a sound, and the body remembers the rest. A veteran could be in another position days later, on another ridge, with another unit, and still feel the first night return when the signal came. That is not superstition. That is memory doing its job too well. The soundscape also included American noises, and those mattered just as much. The clack of a machine gun being charged, the slap of a magazine, a sergeant moving down the line in a low voice, the cough of a mortar leaving the tube behind the position, the sharp pop of illumination rounds, the cries of wounded men, orders shouted because whispers no longer worked. The American line was not silent either. Once the alarm spread, the defenders created their own wall of sound, partly to fight and partly to reassure themselves that they were not alone. A machine gun firing nearby could be deafening, but it also meant someone was still there, still operating the weapon, still holding a piece of the line. There is something very human about that. In darkness, sound becomes proof of company. The voice of a friend matters. The answer to a shouted question matters. The continued firing of a gun on the flank matters. Silence from a position where a gun had been firing a minute earlier can feel like a physical blow. Men listened not only for the enemy but for each other. Is Baker Company still there? Is the left still holding? Is the roadblock firing? Did the mortar section stop because they are out of rounds or because they have been hit? No map can answer those questions quickly in the middle of a night attack. Men answered them by sound, and sometimes sound did not answer. The Chinese understood the importance of confusion. Even when the purpose of whistles and bugles was coordination, the effect on the defender could be disorienting. Signals coming from several points suggested multiple attacks, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. A defender might shift attention toward the loudest sound while quieter movement happened elsewhere. Bugles could echo in the hills. Shouts could seem closer than they were. When combined with flares, smoke, mortar bursts and automatic fire, the result was sensory overload. The American soldier was not calmly interpreting a battlefield. He was trying to survive inside noise. A later Army University press staff ride for Chip Yongli notes that Chinese troops attacked East Ridge with bugles and whistles blaring, and that some wore pieces of American uniforms, causing defenders to hesitate until they confirmed who was approaching. That hesitation is another small, terrible human moment. It is easy to say, identify your target. It is much harder when shapes are moving in bad light, when friendly and enemy equipment may look similar for a second, when a wrong shot could kill an ally, and a delayed shot could let an enemy reach your hole. Sound, sight, and judgment all had to work together under pressure, and the night made each one less reliable. This is one reason the sounds before the attack lived so powerfully in memory. They were attached to decisions made with almost no time. Wake the others. Fire now or wait. Throw a grenade or risk it falling short. Call artillery close or hold off because friendlies may be out there. Shoot at the silhouette or challenge it. Stay in place or shift to the next hole. Every sound seemed to demand a response, and every response could be wrong. There were also loudspeakers in some areas, though not every battle used them in the same way. Psychological warfare was part of the Korean War on both sides, and veterans sometimes remembered voices, music, or amplified messages in the night. Those sounds had a different quality from bugles and whistles. A bugle announces movement. A loudspeaker enters the mind more deliberately. It can taunt. It can call on men to surrender. It can make the enemy seem present even when he is not visible. The most frightening thing about a voice in darkness is that it understands it is being heard. It addresses you. It turns a battlefield into something uncomfortably personal. But even without loudspeakers, the human voice carried. Chinese soldiers shouted during assaults. Some shouted commands. Some shouted to build courage. Some may have shouted to frighten the defenders. American soldiers heard those voices without understanding the words, and that lack of understanding mattered. A shouted language you do not know can sound larger than itself under fear. You cannot separate instruction from threat. You cannot tell whether a voice is calling men forward or calling for help. All you know is that there are men close enough for voices. The same was true in reverse, of course. Chinese soldiers heard American shouting, American weapons, American artillery, English commands, and the machinery of an army far richer in firepower. They too heard death before they saw it. A night attack was not quiet courage on one side and fear on the other. It was sound moving both ways across frozen ground. But the American terror we are following tonight came especially from being the ones waiting, the ones listening for an enemy who preferred the dark and often seemed to arrive with noise before form. There is a strange contradiction here. The Chinese often used stealth to get near, but the remembered attacks were noisy. That is not really a contradiction once you separate approach from assault. The approach could be silent for hours. Men might move in small groups, crawl, wait, use gullies, freeze in place when flares rose, and edge closer while Americans strained to hear them. Then, at the chosen moment, the attack could erupt with sound. To the defender, the effect was that silence itself had been lying. The hillside had seemed empty because the final noise had not yet begun. That may be the most frightening thing of all. Not just the bugle, but the realization that the bugle was late. The danger had been there before it sounded. The men had already crossed distance. They had already found the draw. They had already moved into grenade range or close to it. The bugle did not warn of a distant threat. It confirmed a nearby one. The body reacts differently to nearby danger. A man under distant artillery can be terrified, but he may also feel that chance is choosing. A shell lands where it lands. A man facing close infantry knows that another human being is trying to reach him personally, or at least reach the hole he occupies. The sounds before a Chinese assault brought that knowledge forward. They told the defender that somewhere in the dark men were closing the last distance, and that soon the fight might become face-to-face. This is where we need to be careful with the word psychological. It can sound as if fear was separate from the real fight, as if bugles and whistles were only mental tricks. They were not. The fear was psychological because all fear is processed in the mind and body, but it was rooted in concrete danger. Chinese attacks did overrun positions. They did cut roads. They did reach barbed wire and foxholes. They did force hand-to-hand fighting. The sounds were frightening because men had learned they often preceded real violence. A harmless sound repeated before deadly event stops being harmless. One object in the National Museum of the United States Army makes this memory physical. A battle-worn Chinese bugle from the Korean War, donated by a US veteran who had served during the conflict. The museum describes the bugle as a battlefield trophy and a relic of the kind of sound many soldiers associated with attacks in the dark. It is worth thinking about that object. A bugle is small enough to hold. It is not a tank or a cannon or a monument. It can sit in a display case, silent. Yet for the men who heard instruments like it in Korea, the silence of the object would never quite remove the sound from memory. By the time a Chinese attack fully opened, the soundscape became overwhelming. Bugles and whistles might give way to grenades, rifles, submachine guns, mortars, and machine guns. The first wave of noise became a flood. Men shouted for ammunition. Someone yelled that they were inside the wire. Someone called for artillery. A flare burst overhead and showed figures moving too close. The machine gunner tried to hold a sector. The assistant gunner fed the belt. Riflemen fired until clips or magazines emptied. Grenades were thrown by feel and by guess. In that chaos, the original bugle might disappear, but it had already done its work. It had opened the door. And yet the moments before the full attack remain distinct in memory, because they were the last moments of anticipation. There is always a final second before a position is hit, even if no one can identify it while living through it. A last quiet breath, a last glance to the side, a last thought that maybe the sound is farther away than it seems. Then the first grenade lands close, or the first figures appear, or the first man screams, and the battle enters the trench. That movement from sound to contact is the hinge of the night. Before it, the enemy is imagined through noise. After it, he is present. Before it, a man can hope the attack will pass to another sector. After it, the only question is whether the position will hold. Before it, fear spreads ahead of the attackers. After it, fear and action become the same thing. So when we listen back through these accounts, when we hear veterans and official histories remembering bugles, whistles, horns, bells, cymbals, shouts, and the sudden roar of weapons, we are not collecting colourful details. We are hearing the mechanism by which night became a battlefield. The sounds told men when to wake, when to brace, when to fire, when to fear for the flanks, when to wonder whether the line still existed. They carried commands to Chinese troops and dread to American positions. They made the invisible visible in the only way darkness allowed. The sound before the attack was not separate from the attack. It was the first part of it, and once the signals had rolled across the hills, once the listening posts had pulled back or gone silent, once the flares had begun to rise and the machine guns had started searching the dark, the waiting ended. The shadows that had been only shapes a few minutes earlier began to move with purpose. Men appeared where the hillside had seemed empty. Grenades came tumbling into holes. Figures reached the wire. The distance closed so quickly that the sounds were no longer warnings. They were mixed with breath, dirt, snow, muzzle flashes, and the desperate work of keeping the enemy out of the trench. By the time the shadows reached the trenches, the attack had already been alive for several minutes. It had moved first as sound, then as rumour, then as shape. A whistle somewhere on the slope. A bugle answered from another direction. A flare rose and showed nothing. Another flare rose and showed too much. Men who had been staring into darkness suddenly saw figures where the hillside had seemed empty a moment earlier. The distance between waiting and fighting disappeared. There was no time left to think about the whole war, no time to think about China, Washington, Seoul, the Yalu, strategy, orders, or anything large enough to require calm. There was only the hole in front of you, the rifle in your hands, the man beside you, and the terrible fact that the enemy had come close enough to be seen as a body and not just heard as a sound. We should pause on the word trenches for a moment, because Korea was not the Western Front of 1916. These were not always long, continuous trench systems with duckboards and deep communication lines. Often they were foxholes, scrapes, bunkers, shallow firing pits, slit trenches, sandbagged positions, roadblocks, and rough perimeters cut into frozen hillsides. But to the man inside one, the difference in vocabulary did not matter much once the attack reached him. The edge of the position was the edge of his world. If the enemy got over that edge, the war became immediate in a way that no map could describe. This was the stage of the Chinese night attack that American soldiers feared most, because it stripped away almost every advantage that had protected them at a distance. Artillery was still powerful, but artillery became complicated when enemy troops were too close to friendly holes. Mortars could still fire, but the margin for error shrank. Machine guns were still deadly, but they needed fields of fire, ammunition, functioning barrels, and men alive enough to serve them. Rifles still mattered, but at close range there was no tidy marksmanship. A man fired at shadows, muzzle flashes, movement, and sometimes at someone close enough that he could see the face only after the shot. The Chinese had chosen the night partly to survive American air power and firepower, and when they reached the perimeter, the reason became clear. They were trying to drag the fight into the space where American strength was most difficult to organize. At Chipyong-ni in February 1951, this kind of pressure came against a surrounded American and French force holding a key road junction. The US Army Heritage and Education Center describes Chinese and North Korean forces launching a major offensive on the night of February 11th, with Chipyong-ni among the targets, and the defenders soon found themselves in a perimeter fight where the enemy pressed close in the dark. The name Chipyong-ni matters because it shows that the night attacks did not only belong to the shock of November 1950. By early 1951, American commanders had learned much more about Chinese methods, and still the experience of being attacked after dark by troops closing on the wire remained frightening and dangerous. Knowledge helped. It did not make the shadows harmless. Imagine the perimeter just before contact. The men know they are surrounded or nearly surrounded. They know the roads matter. They know the hills around them are not empty. They know the enemy has been watching. They have probably already heard movement, firing, or signals on other parts of the line. The officers have placed weapons, checked sectors, and told the men to hold fire until the targets are clear. That last instruction sounds easy from a desk and almost impossible in a hole at night. Hold fire, wait. Let them get closer. A soldier can understand the logic. Ammunition is limited. Muzzle flashes reveal positions. Firing too early wastes bullets and may not hit anything. But understanding logic does not quiet the body. When men are coming through darkness, every instinct says fire now. So he waits, or tries to. The first figures are hard to believe. They come low, sometimes crouched, sometimes running, sometimes crawling through brush or snow. Some carry rifles, some carry grenades, some carry satchel charges or demolition materials. Some may be wearing quilted winter clothing that makes their shapes unfamiliar in the poor light. At times, attackers wore or carried bits of captured American equipment, and that could cause hesitation in the dark, because identification had to happen in seconds, and the cost of error was death. An Army University press staff write account of Chipyong-ni notes that Chinese troops attacked with bugles and whistles blaring, and that some wore pieces of American uniforms, making defenders hesitate until they confirmed who was approaching. That hesitation is one of those small human details that tells you more than a paragraph of strategy. A man does not want to shoot a friend. He also does not want to wait until an enemy is close enough to throw a grenade into his hole. At the wire, the fight changed character. Barbed wire was meant to slow men down, bunch them together, and hold them under fire. In daylight, with good fields of fire and prepared weapons, it could be devastating. At night, in broken terrain, wire was still useful, but it was not a wall. Men cut it, crawled under it. found gaps, fell on it, got tangled in it, died in it. Others came behind them. Sometimes bodies themselves became part of the obstacle. Defenders fired into the wire and beyond it, trying to stop movement before it reached the holes. Attackers threw grenades to blind, wound, and force heads down. A grenade at close range has a different psychological weight than distant shell fire. Artillery can feel like weather, terrible and mechanical. A grenade feels personal. Someone close enough to throw it has chosen your piece of ground. There is a specific terror in hearing a grenade land near you in darkness. It does not sound like a large thing. A thud, a clink, a short bounce against earth, maybe nothing if it lands in snow or soft mud. Then the mind races faster than the body can move. Where is it? Is it in the hole? Outside? Can it be thrown back? Is there time? Men in close fighting learn to recognize sounds that no one should have to know. The pin, the spoon, the roll. The dull landing. In a night attack, the grenade often arrived before the attacker did, and when it exploded, the hole filled with dirt, smoke, metal, and shouting. If the man survived, he had to lift his head again because the next figure might already be there. This is what the phrase close combat really means. It means no one is far enough away. It means the defender is no longer simply firing at a line on a slope. He is defending the exact shape of his hole. A rifle butt becomes useful. A bayonet becomes possible. A shovel can become a weapon. Men grab at clothing, helmets, weapons, arms. They fire so close that muzzle blast is felt on skin. They shout not because shouting is brave, but because the body needs to force sound out of itself. They trip over bodies. They cannot tell who is wounded and who is dead until later. They hear their own language, enemy voices, and the confused language of pain, which belongs to everyone. Official sources sometimes use compact phrases for these moments. Hand-to-hand combat, close fighting, positions changed hands. These phrases are necessary because history cannot remain forever inside each individual second. But each phrase contains an ugly intimacy. The US Army's Korean War Medal of Honor citations include accounts of positions attacked under cover of darkness by large enemy forces, with defenders rallying into fierce hand-to-hand combat and treating or evacuating wounded under fire. Those words are formal, because citations are formal. The actual scene was not. It was dirt, breath, weapons, blood, and men making decisions with almost no time left in which to make them. At Chosun, the terrain and cold made the arrival of the shadows even worse. The Marine Corps Forces career account describes the Battle of Chosun Reservoir as a 2-week fight in which about 30,000 US, South Korean, and British troops faced around 120,000 Chinese soldiers in brutal winter conditions. Numbers like that can flatten the feeling if we let them. So bring it back to one roadblock, one hill, one Marine or soldier trying to hold a position, while the enemy comes through the dark. His gloves are stiff. His weapon may be sluggish from cold. His feet hurt or have gone numb. He may not have slept properly in days. The men attacking him are also freezing, also exhausted, also trying to survive. But once they reach the wire, those shared hardships do not create mercy. They create closeness. The Chinese often try to attack from several directions, or at least make it feel that way. That mattered because a defender's courage is tied to orientation. A man can endure a frontal attack if he trusts that his flanks are held. He can endure fire from the left if he knows the right is safe. But when figures appear from more than one direction, when bugles and whistles sound around the perimeter, when firing begins behind a place that should be behind, orientation begins to fail. The soldier no longer feels that he's part of a clean line. He feels like he is inside a shrinking circle. That shrinking circle feeling was one of the worst parts of a night perimeter fight. Every report was urgent and incomplete. They are in the wire. They are on the left. They hit the command post. The roadblock is pulling back. We need ammunition. The machine gun is out. The lieutenant is hit. None of these reports tells the whole truth. Each tells enough to frighten. Officers and non-commissioned officers had to decide what to reinforce, what to abandon, where to send the reserve if there was one, whether to call artillery dangerously close, whether a position had been lost or was merely silent. In darkness, silence from a position could mean its radio failed, its wire line was cut, its men were lying low, or its men were gone. Command became a form of guesswork under pressure. The men inside the holes had their own version of command. Keep this sector. Keep this gun firing. Wake him. Pass grenades. Do not bunch up. Watch that draw. If he goes down, you take his place. This is the kind of authority that exists at arm's length. A sergeant's voice might matter more than a colonel's plan in the exact moment the enemy reaches the trench. A calm corporal could hold a whole together. A machine gunner could become the centre of the world for everyone near him. If the gun kept firing, the line felt alive. If it stopped, everyone heard it. Machine guns had a special importance in these close attacks. They could break up groups of attackers before they reached the position, cut across approaches, and give defenders something steady in chaos. But they also attracted fire, and keeping them running was hard work. Belts had to be fed, barrels could overheat, ammunition had to be carried forward. Men serving them could be wounded quickly because the gun's position mattered to both sides. The Chinese knew where the automatic weapons were once they opened up. They tried to knock them out with grenades, small arms, and direct rushes. The defenders knew that if the gun failed, the shadows might reach the holes in greater numbers. Around a machine gun, courage often looked like repetition. Feed the belt, clear the jam, replace the man who fell, keep firing. The flare light made these moments both clearer and more unreal. Under a flare, the battlefield was exposed briefly in white or greenish light. Men saw attackers caught in wire, men running low across open ground, men falling, men getting up again, men who had reached too close. Then the flare died, and the world disappeared. A defender might fire at what he remembered seeing, not what he could still see. Another flare rose somewhere else, and the eye jumped to it. Shadows stretched and moved. Smoke drifted. Snow reflected. The light helped and confused at the same time. It gave targets, but it also gave terror a shape. Once Chinese troops got into a trench, bunker, or foxhole line, the fight became almost impossible to describe neatly. A position might be lost for minutes and retaken. One hole might be overrun while the next kept firing. A small group of defenders might counterattack with grenades and drive attackers out of a section of line. Men could be separated by only a few yards and live through different battles. One soldier might spend an hour firing into the dark and never see an enemy clearly. Another might fight at such close range that the war became a single body struggling at the edge of his hole. Later, both men would say they had been in the same attack, and both would be telling the truth. The Chinese soldier reaching the trench had also crossed a terrible distance. He had climbed, crawled, or run through fire to get there. He may have seen the men ahead of him fall. He may have been pushed by orders, by comrades behind him, by fear of failure, by belief, by discipline, or simply by the forward motion of the assault. The American remembered him as a shadow becoming a man. The Chinese soldier may have remembered the American position as a storm of fire and light, a place that had to be reached before dawn or not at all. This is why close combat is tragic in a way that distant combat sometimes hides. It reveals that both sides were full of human beings driven into a space where survival meant destroying another human being at arm's length. There were moments when the defenders used weapons that feel almost primitive because the range had become so short. Grenades rolled or tossed into shallow depressions. Bayonets fixed when men expected contact. Rifle butts used when firing was no longer possible. Entrenching tools, knives, anything reachable. The history of modern war often emphasizes machinery, but at the trench edge in Korea, the oldest forms of fighting returned because the night and the terrain had carried men back into them. A 20th century war with jets overhead could still end in a frozen hole with two men struggling in the dirt. For wounded men, the trench fight was especially cruel. A wounded soldier might be unable to move but still aware of the fight passing over him. He might be stepped on by friends or enemies. He might hear attackers in the hole next to him. He might try to reload with one working hand. He might call for a medic and receive no answer because the medic was pinned down, wounded himself, or already helping someone worse off. Aid stations could be hit. Evacuation routes could be cut. The cold slowed bleeding in some cases, but also killed by exposure. At Chosin, the cold was so severe that stories of frozen blood plasma, frozen wounds, and men lying outside in sleeping bags became part of the battle's memory. A veteran account from the Chosin area recalls more than 500 wounded being brought into one area the first night, with some kept outside in sleeping bags while temperatures fell far below zero. There is no clean way to imagine that. The wounded did not stop being afraid because they were no longer standing. They became more dependent on the line holding. If the trench fell, their chances narrowed. If the road was cut, evacuation failed. If the medics could not reach them, time became an enemy. A man who could no longer fight might still listen to the bugles and whistles and know exactly what they meant. That helpless listening may have been one of the loneliest experiences of the war. The defenders also feared being bypassed. This sounds less dramatic than hand-to-hand combat, but it was often more damaging to morale. If attackers flowed around a position rather than directly into it, the men inside might continue firing while slowly realizing that the enemy had passed them and was now somewhere behind. That realization could turn a strong point into a trap, stay and be surrounded, or withdraw through darkness where the enemy may already be waiting. Many Chinese attacks sought exactly this kind of effect, pressuring the front while infiltrators found ways around it. The US Army's Korean War campaign summary notes that Chinese forces had amassed large armies by marching under cover of darkness and camouflaging during the day, remaining comparatively safe from detection in rugged mountain terrain. That same ability to use darkness and terrain shaped the smaller nightmare of the trench. The enemy might not stop at the edge of your position. He might move past it and make your rear unsafe. This fear of being cut off travelled quickly. A soldier heard firing behind him and suddenly everything changed. The trench no longer faced one direction. He turned his head, trying to understand whether the sound came from friendly weapons, enemy weapons, or both. Someone shouted that the command post was hit. Someone else denied it. A runner arrived out of breath with half a message. The line became a circle in the mind before it became one on the ground. Once men felt surrounded, every shadow behind them mattered as much as every shadow in front, and yet many positions held. This is important because the story of terror is not the same as the story of defeat. At Chipyongni, the surrounded 23rd Regimental Combat Team, an attached French battalion, held their perimeter against repeated attacks until relief arrived, and the battle became a turning point in showing that Chinese offensives could be stopped by prepared, coordinated defence. The Army Heritage account identifies Chipyongni as a key road junction targeted during the February 1951 offensive, while later summaries emphasise the importance of the stand-in halting Chinese momentum. Men were terrified and still fought effectively. They were exhausted and still loaded weapons. They were confused and still held sectors. Fear did not vanish. It became part of the work. There is something worth noticing here about discipline. In a night trench fight, discipline is not parade ground neatness. It is not polished boots or perfect salutes. It is the ability to do a small necessary thing while frightened. Hold fire until they are close. Do not abandon the gun. Pass the ammunition. Stay in your sector. Do not shoot at every sound. Pull the wounded man back. Tell the truth about what you see, not what you fear. These acts sound simple, and each one can become almost impossible under pressure. Units that survived these attacks often did so because enough men performed enough of these simple acts at the right time. The Chinese, too, depended on discipline. To close with a defended perimeter under machine gun and artillery fire required more than numbers. It required men to keep moving when every instinct argued against it. It required leaders to maintain direction in darkness. It required signals to be followed, groups to reform, and casualties to be absorbed without the attack dissolving immediately. The American memory of endless waves often came from seeing one group stopped and another appear behind it. Whether or not the numbers were always as large as they seemed, the impression was devastating. The trench defender felt that the dark kept producing men. At very close range, time broke apart. A fight that lasted 20 minutes could feel like an entire night. A night that lasted until dawn could later be remembered as flashes. The first bugle, the man beside me hit, the grenade, the flare, the shape at the wire, the machine gun stopping, the cold after the firing eased. Memory under combat does not always preserve sequence. It preserves impact. This is one reason veterans sometimes told these stories in fragments. The mind kept what it could. Eventually, in many attacks, the pressure slackened. Not always because the defenders had an easy victory. Sometimes because Chinese units had suffered heavily and pulled back before daylight. Sometimes because they had achieved a local objective. Sometimes because they were regrouping for another attempt. Sometimes because dawn was coming, and dawn threatened attackers who had relied on darkness. The first hint of morning did not feel beautiful. It felt like exposure and accounting. The shadows that had reached the trenches became bodies on the wire, bodies near holes, bodies in gullies, discarded weapons, torn clothing, frozen blood, spent cartridge cases, ripped sandbags, broken wire, and men looking at one another with faces that seemed older than they had been the evening before. Morning also showed how close it had been. This is a detail men remembered. In darkness, the enemy feels everywhere. In daylight, a soldier could see that some attackers had fallen only feet from his hole. A grenade crater might be close enough to touch. A body might lie across the parapet. A Chinese soldier killed inside the position might prove what the night had already told them. They had come all the way in. That evidence could produce pride, horror, and a deeper fear of the next night. We held. But look how close they got. The trench after a night attack had its own silence. Not peaceful silence. After battle silence. Men checked friends, medics worked, officers counted. Ammunition was redistributed. Weapons were cleaned because the next attack might come before anyone was ready. The dead had to be moved if possible. The wounded had to be carried. Prisoners, if any were taken, had to be guarded. Reports had to be sent upward in language that could never fully match what the men had just lived. Enemy repulsed. Position restored. Heavy casualties. Hand-to-hand fighting. The report needed to be brief. The experience was not. And for the men who survived, the trench was never quite the same afterward. A hole that had been shelter became a place where the enemy had almost entered, or had entered. A wire line that had looked reassuring became a reminder that wire can be crossed. The hillside that had seemed far away became a path by which men could arrive. The next evening, when the light began to fade, every man knew more than he had known before. Knowledge did not make him calmer. It made him listen harder. That is how the fear deepened over time. It was not only fear of dying. It was fear of being reached. Fear of waking to a shape above you. Fear of a grenade in the hole. Fear of hearing your own machine gun stop. Fear of losing the line beside you and not knowing it until the enemy came from that direction. Fear of being wounded and unable to move while the shadows crossed the trench. Fear of making the wrong decision in the 1 second allowed. The Chinese night attack pressed on all of those fears at once. So when we picture the shadows reaching the trenches, we should not picture only a rush of faceless men. We should picture a collision of systems and bodies. Chinese troops using darkness to neutralize firepower and close distance. American troops using wire, flares, machine guns, artillery and discipline to hold them out. Both sides trapped by terrain and weather. Both sides moving through fear. The trench edge was where doctrine became touch, where signals became bodies, where maps became holes in the ground. The attack did not end when the first shadows reached the wire. In some ways, that was when the real test began. Could the defenders keep the line from folding? Could they keep their heads when the enemy was too close for comfort? Could they tell friend from enemy in flare light? Could they counter-attack a lost hole? Could they carry wounded men out without opening the sector? Could they survive until daylight forced the attackers back or made the battlefield visible again? Each question had to be answered by men who had already been awake too long, cold too long, afraid too long. And if they answered yes, if the line held through the worst hours, they still had to live with what the night had shown them. They had to live with the knowledge that the enemy could come close enough to touch. They had to live with the sounds that came before it, the shadows that followed, and the faces seen for half a second under a flare. They had to live with the stories passed from hole to hole afterward, stories that grew, changed, sharpened, and sometimes turned into rumour. Because after the shadows reached the trenches, another battle continued inside the minds of the men who had held them, and that battle did not always wait for nightfall to begin. After the shadows reached the trenches, another part of the battle began, and it did not always stop when the firing stopped. It stayed in the body. It stayed in the way men listened after dark. It stayed in the way a soldier's hand moved toward his rifle before he was fully awake. It stayed in the jokes men told too loudly the next morning, and in the men who didn't joke at all. A night attack ended on the map when the enemy pulled back, or when the line was restored, or when a report said the position had held. But inside the men who had waited through it, heard it, fought it, and survived it, the attack often continued in smaller ways. A bugle heard once could be remembered for weeks. A whistle could become a private alarm. A patch of brush that had hidden nothing in daylight could still look occupied after sunset. The war outside the trench was made of movement, orders, weapons, weather, and ground. The war inside the mind was made of expectation. This is one of the reasons fear became so powerful in Korea. It did not remain attached only to the actual moments of combat. It spread into the hours around combat. It entered the waiting. It entered the quiet. It entered the rumours that moved from one position to another. A man did not need to be under attack at that exact moment to feel the Chinese night attack working on him. He only had to believe one might come. That belief was not imaginary. It had been earned by experience. By late 1950, American soldiers had seen Chinese troops appear in places that did not make sense to them, had heard bugles and whistles before assaults, had watched roads become unsafe, and had learned that a position could be struck from more than one direction after dark. The US Army's summary of the war records the large Chinese offensive of November 26 to 30th, 1950, as the moment when Chinese forces attacked and defeated outnumbered United Nations units in North Korea, inflicting heavy casualties and changing the direction of the war. But a soldier does not experience a war-changing offensive as an offensive. He experiences it as cold fingers, bad sleep, sudden firing, a missing friend, a roadblock where the map said the road should be open, and a rumour that the next unit over has been hit worse than anyone is admitting. That is how large events enter the nervous system. They arrive as fragments. Rumour has always been part of war because war creates the exact conditions in which rumour thrives. Information is incomplete, men are frightened, communications fail. People hear explosions in the distance and want to know what they mean. A private hears one sentence from a runner, half a sentence from a radio operator, a guess from a sergeant, and by the time the story travels down the line, it has become more definite than it deserves to be. The Chinese are behind us. The road is cut. The whole regiment is gone. They are wearing American uniforms. They do not take prisoners. They are massing in the valley. They are coming tonight. Some rumours were false. Some were exaggerated. Some were true enough to be worse than fiction. This is the uncomfortable thing about rumour in Korea. It was not simply ignorance. It was often a rough attempt to explain real danger before official information caught up. Chinese forces did infiltrate through gaps. They did use darkness and terrain to approach positions. They did sometimes appear behind or beside units that expected the enemy only in front. At Chipyong-ni in February 1951, American and French troops held a perimeter against repeated attacks during a large Chinese and North Korean offensive, and the US Army Heritage and Education Center notes that the Chinese and North Korean offensive began on the night of February 11th, with the key road junction at Chipyong-ni among the targets. A man who had heard that Chinese troops could surround a position after dark was not believing a ghost story. He was absorbing the basic lesson of the battlefield. Still, truth changed as it travelled. A company hit hard in the night might be described by morning as wiped out, even if many had survived. A patrol that disappeared might be assumed captured, killed, or overrun before anyone knew. A bugle from one ridge might become reports of bugles from every ridge. A few enemy soldiers in captured clothing could become a broader fear that anyone moving in the dark might be a disguised attacker. The mind does this under stress. It enlarges danger in order to prepare for it. That can save lives, but it can also consume them from inside. The fear was not cowardice. This needs to be said plainly. The men who feared Chinese night attacks were not weak men. Many fought through cold, hunger, wounds, exhaustion, and isolation. Fear was a rational response to a pattern that had already proved deadly. The problem was not that they felt fear. The problem was that the fear had nowhere to go. It could not be solved by one good night's sleep because sleep itself had become uncertain. It could not be solved by daylight because daylight only led toward another evening. It could not be solved by being told to be brave because bravery does not erase the sound of a bugle coming from a hill that was supposed to be empty. Think about what a man carried into the next night after surviving an attack. He carried the memory of where the enemy had come through. He carried the sound of the first whistle. He carried the moment the machine gun stopped. He carried the face of the man beside him when the flare went up. He carried the sight of bodies near the wire in the morning, proof that the enemy had been close enough to cross the ground he had been staring at. He carried the knowledge that he might have fired too soon or too late, or at the wrong shadow. He carried questions that no after-action report could answer for him. Did I do enough? Did I freeze? Did I leave someone? Will I react the same way tonight? There is a kind of fear that comes before experience and a different kind that comes after it. Before experience, fear is vague. It is made of imagination. After experience, fear becomes specific. The man knows the sound a grenade makes when it lands near frozen earth. He knows how quickly figures can appear under flare light. He knows the smell of a weapon fired too long. He knows how the wounded sound when they are trying not to panic. That kind of knowledge does not calm a person. It teaches him what to dread accurately. This was especially difficult because the Korean War was a war of repeated extremes: rapid advance, sudden reversal, desperate defense, retreat, counterattack, static fighting, bitter cold, mountain roads, and small perimeters under pressure. At Chosin, a Marine Corps account describes roughly 30,000 US, South Korean, and British troops facing about 120,000 Chinese soldiers in a brutal 2-week battle around the reservoir. Numbers like that were not abstractions to the men in the positions. They became the feeling that the enemy was always more numerous than expected, always closer than reported, always able to return after suffering losses that would have stopped another force. Whether the Chinese numbers in a given attack were actually as large as they seemed mattered less at 2 a.m. than the impression they created. Darkness multiplies. A dozen men moving in different places can sound like many more. Several bugles can seem like a whole army. A small group behind the line can make a company feel surrounded. The phrase "they keep coming" appears often in veterans' memories of wars, and in Korea it carried a particular weight, because men had watched attacks continue despite heavy fire. The American soldier did not always know whether he was facing a platoon, a battalion, or a regiment. He knew only that the dark was producing men faster than he could understand. Rumour also affected how soldiers saw the enemy. Chinese soldiers were sometimes described in ways that made them seem less human and more like a force of nature, endless, silent until the bugles, indifferent to casualties, able to live without food, able to appear from nowhere. Some of these descriptions came from genuine awe at their discipline and endurance. Some came from fear. Some came from wartime racial and political prejudice, which shaped how Americans understood a communist Chinese enemy during the early Cold War. But the effect was the same. The enemy became larger in the mind than the individual men who composed it. A Chinese soldier was no longer simply another frightened, cold infantryman moving under orders. He became part of the Chinese, a phrase that could hold any number of fears at once. This matters because dehumanization works in both directions in war. It can make killing easier, but it can also make fear worse. A human enemy has limits. He gets cold, he gets lost, he runs out of ammunition, he is afraid. A half-imagined enemy in rumour has fewer limits. He sees in the dark. He never stops. He can be anywhere. The more monstrous the enemy becomes in the mind, the harder it is for a soldier to rest. The Chinese night attack frightened Americans partly because it succeeded often enough to make exaggeration believable. At the same time, American soldiers were receiving another message from their own commanders and culture. Hold, do your job, keep moving, do not break. War does not give men much space to say they are afraid. A soldier might admit to cold, hunger, anger, boredom or hatred more easily than fear. Fear had to be hidden under jokes, profanity, routine or silence. Men might call it being jumpy, edgy, worn out or tired. They might say someone had the shakes. They might say a man was no good anymore, or that he had had enough. The medical language of the time often used terms such as combat fatigue or battle exhaustion. A Korean Journal of Medical History article describes combat fatigue, also called battle exhaustion, as a psychiatric condition linked to extreme exhaustion and helplessness after prolonged exposure to stressful combat situations, and notes that the US military used forward treatment units and mobile psychiatric detachments during the war. The term combat fatigue sounds almost gentle, until you imagine the men behind it. Fatigue can mean tiredness after work. This was not that. This was the exhaustion of being asked to remain alert when the body had no alertness left to give. It was the helplessness of repeated shelling, night attacks, cold, loss and uncertainty. It could look like shaking, muteness, panic, numbness, collapse, anger, confusion, or a man simply unable to keep functioning. The Korean War did not invent combat stress, of course. Earlier wars had called similar conditions shell shock, war neurosis, battle fatigue, and other names. But Korea gave American military psychiatry another harsh classroom, and the goal of treatment often remained practical: return men to duty if possible. Research on Korean War veterans notes that military psychiatrists did attend to combat fatigue during the war, but the focus, as in earlier conflicts, was frequently on getting soldiers back to service. That fact is worth sitting with for a moment. A man might be overwhelmed by what he had seen and heard, treated near the front, rested briefly, spoken to by a doctor or medic, and then sent back because the line needed men. From a military point of view, that may have made sense. Units needed strength. Evacuation could remove soldiers permanently from combat roles. But from the standpoint of the person living inside that body, it meant the inner war was often treated only long enough to make the outer war possible again. The modern word PTSD was not available to these men. Post-traumatic stress disorder did not become a formal diagnosis until the DSM-3 in 1980, decades after the Korean War. So Korean War veterans who carried symptoms afterward often lived for years with older, less precise labels, or with no label at all. That matters because language shapes what suffering is allowed to become. If a man has no words for nightmares, startle responses, anger, numbness, intrusive memories, or the inability to sleep, he may believe the problem is simply himself. He may believe he should be over it. He may believe silence is the only honourable option. But during the war itself, the symptoms were already there in forms men could recognise, even if they did not have our vocabulary. The inability to sleep, the startle at sudden sound, the feeling that the body remains in danger after danger passes, the way a smell, sound, or time of day can bring a man back to a place he does not want to be. A bugle in Korea could become that trigger long before anyone used that word. A whistle could do it. Darkness could do it. Cold could do it. The mind stores fear with details attached. Let us return to one position after a night attack. Morning has come. The men have counted casualties. The wounded have been carried away if the route is open. The dead have been moved if there is time and strength. The weapons are being cleaned. Ammunition is redistributed. Coffee is made if anyone has coffee. The officers are writing reports. The men are talking, because talking is one way the mind tries to sort what happened. Someone says the Chinese were everywhere. Someone says there must have been thousands. Someone says they saw one wearing an American jacket. Someone says the company on the left almost broke. Someone says the company on the left did break, but nobody wants to admit it. Someone says the bugles mean they're coming again tonight. Someone else tells him to shut up. This is how rumour and morale wrestle with each other. Morale is not cheerful optimism. In combat, morale is often the ability to believe that your fear can be survived. Rumour can damage that belief if it makes danger feel endless and command feel blind. But rumour can also prepare men if it warns them of real patterns. The line between useful warning and corrosive fear is very thin. Tell men too little, and they invent worse. Tell men too much without giving them a plan, and the truth itself can break confidence. Leaders in Korea had to manage not only ammunition and positions, but also the emotional weather of the unit. A good sergeant mattered enormously here. He might not use formal language about morale, but he knew when men were talking themselves into panic. He knew when to correct a rumour, when to laugh at it, when to tell everyone to get back to work, and when to quietly check the man who had gone silent. He knew that fear spreads through idle time, so men were given tasks. Improve the hole, check the wire, clean the gun, carry ammo, melt snow if possible, fix the field phone line, help the medic. Movement did not erase fear, but it gave it a place to go. The problem was night returned no matter how busy the day had been. As sunset approached, the mind began reviewing rumours again. This is the hour they like. This is when they came last time. That ridge looks empty, but it looked empty before. The wire was fixed, but there might be gaps. The listening post is out there, but what if they get cut off? The left flank is supposed to be covered, but is it really? Every practical question carried emotional weight. The Chinese choice of night had turned evening itself into a warning signal. Some men responded by becoming extremely alert. Others became numb. Some became angry, and anger could feel better than fear because it had a direction. Some became superstitious in small ways. They carried objects, repeated routines, avoided certain words, sat in the same hole, checked the same magazine twice, smoked at the same time, or refused to talk about going home. Soldiers in every war do this. Superstition is not foolishness when control is scarce. It is the mind making handles in a world that has too few. Letters home also carried a strange burden. A soldier might write about weather, food, friends, and longing, but avoid explaining what the nights were like. How could he describe bugles in the dark to someone sitting in a warm kitchen in Ohio, Texas, California, or Pennsylvania? How could he say he was afraid without frightening his mother or wife? How could he explain that he could not sleep because sleep felt like betrayal? Many men softened the truth. Others said almost nothing. The war inside the mind was often kept away from home because home needed to remain a place untouched by it, at least on paper. There is a quiet cruelty in that too. The people who loved these soldiers wanted to understand. But understanding required details the men did not want to give, and families did not want to imagine. So the soldier carried two versions of himself. The one in the letter, cold but managing, tired but fine, hoping to be home someday. And the one in the hole, listening for whistles, smelling smoke and frozen earth, staring into a darkness that had already proved it could move. Fear also changed how men understood time. During a night attack, minutes stretched. During the day after, hours could disappear in exhaustion. The calendar became less important than the cycle of a light and dark. Dawn meant survival, at least for now. Afternoon meant preparation. Evening meant tension. Midnight meant danger. Before Chinese intervention, some soldiers had been told, or had hoped, that the war might end soon. After the attacks of the late 1950, that hope became harder to hold. The Army's Korean War overview marks the Chinese intervention as one of the major turning points that prevented a quick end to the conflict and pushed United Nations forces back from the northern advance. For the men, the broken promise was not only strategic, it was emotional. Home by Christmas had become another rumour, and one of the worst kind because it had asked them to imagine relief before the worst nights arrived. Not every soldier broke. Not every soldier was permanently haunted. People vary and units vary. Some men found strength in comradeship, faith, anger, training, leadership, routine, or simply the human ability to endure more than seems possible. Some men became more effective because experience taught them what to expect. A veteran of several night attacks might be afraid but less surprised. He knew where to place grenades. He knew when not to waste ammunition. He knew that bugles meant danger, but not necessarily defeat. He could tell a replacement to stay low, watch the wire, and keep his rifle clear. That transfer of knowledge was one of the ways fear became survivable. But survival did not mean the fear disappeared. It became managed. There is a difference. Managed fear can still live in the jaw, the shoulders, the stomach, the way a man sleeps with one ear open. It can be hidden under competence. The soldier who moves steadily down the line may still be terrified. The officer giving orders may still feel dread. The medic helping wounded men may still be afraid he will freeze when the next cry comes from outside the wire. Courage often looks calm only from a distance. By early 1951, United Nations forces were learning how to blunt Chinese attacks more effectively. At Chipyong-ni, the defenders held a prepared perimeter against repeated assaults, and the battle became important because it showed that Chinese offensives could be stopped when units were well positioned, mutually supporting, and supplied with artillery and air support when weather and daylight allowed. This mattered for morale. Men needed proof that the night attacks could be survived. Not just individually survived, but defeated. A successful defence could interrupt rumour. It could replace, they always get through, with, they can be stopped. That change inside the mind was almost as important as the tactical result. Still, even victory left marks. A position held at Chipyong-ni or Chosin, or along any frozen ridge, did not erase the sounds heard there. It added another memory. The men could say we held, but they also knew what holding had cost. They knew how close the enemy came. They knew which holes were empty in the morning. They knew the wounded men's names. They knew whether they had enough ammunition left for another night. Victory in such conditions could feel less like celebration and more like permission to remain alive a little longer. That is why the psychological story of these attacks is not simply a story of terror. It is also a story of adaptation. Men learned what to listen for. They learned which rumours to trust and which to ignore. They learned to check the ground by daylight so it would make more sense after dark. They learned to expect attacks where the map looked weakest. They learned to sleep in pieces. They learned to talk men down when panic moved faster than facts. They learned that fear did not mean they would fail. This was hard knowledge, and it came at a high price. When we think about these soldiers now, it is tempting to imagine the dramatic moments only. Bugles, flares, shadows, hand-to-hand fighting. But much of the war inside the mind happened in the quieter hours. A man sitting on an ammunition box with a cup of coffee he could barely taste. A replacement pretending not to be scared while listening to veterans talk. A sergeant looking at a hill and calculating whether the Chinese could use that draw. A wounded soldier in an aid station waking at a distant whistle. A man writing home and leaving out everything that would explain why his handwriting shook. The night attacks terrified US soldiers because they attacked the line, but they also attacked trust. Trust in quiet, trust in distance, trust in roads, trust in sleep, trust in the idea that morning would make things understandable. Once that trust was damaged, the mind had to work harder every hour. It had to guard against danger even when none was visible. It had to sort rumour from warning. It had to keep fear useful without letting fear take command. And then, after a night of listening, fighting, or simply waiting for an attack that did not come, morning arrived. Not gently, not as relief in the way people far from war might imagine, but as a grey revealing. Morning showed the ground. It showed the wire. It showed the holes. It showed what rumour had exaggerated and what rumour had failed to make terrible enough. It showed who was still there and who was not. The war inside the mind did not end with daylight, but daylight gave it evidence to work with, and sometimes evidence was almost as hard to face as darkness. Morning after a night attack did not arrive like rescue. That is one of the first things to understand. We're used to thinking of dawn as relief, because in ordinary life it is. Dawn turns a strange room familiar again. Dawn shows the chair that looked like a person in the dark. Dawn makes the noises outside less threatening. But for soldiers in Korea, morning after a Chinese night attack was not simple relief. It was inspection. It was accounting. It was the hour when the ground told the truth. The dark had hidden movement, distance, bodies, mistakes, courage, panic, and loss. Morning did not erase any of that. It only made it visible. A man might first notice the silence. Not peaceful silence, not the quiet of a house before breakfast, but the stunned pause after too much sound. During the night there had been bugles, whistles, shouting, machine guns, grenades, mortars, flares, cries for medics, officers yelling orders, men calling names into the dark, and the hard repeated crack of rifles fired at shapes. Then, at some point before dawn or just after it, the attack had faded. Maybe the Chinese had pulled back before daylight could expose them to American artillery and aircraft. Maybe the position had held. Maybe part of the line had been lost and retaken. Maybe everyone was still too unsure to call it anything. The firing slowed. The last grenades went off. The last burst snapped across the wire. Men kept their rifles ready because no one trusted the end of a night attack the first time it seemed to end. Then came the grey light. Not sunlight at first. Greyness. A slow separation of shapes. The ridge became a ridge again. The wire became wire. The rocks returned to their places. The slope that had been a wall of black became ground with details. Brush, snow, mud, shell holes, broken branches, torn equipment, bodies. A soldier who had spent the night firing into darkness could finally see where the enemy had actually been. Sometimes that sight was worse than imagination. The bodies were closer than he thought. A Chinese soldier lay only a few feet from the hole. A grenade had landed near enough that the crater touched the edge of the position. The wire was bent where men had crawled through it. A dead attacker still had a pair of wire cutters in his hand. A wounded man who had called during the night was found in a place no one could safely reach before. The morning showed not only what happened, but how narrowly it had been survived. This is where the mind could receive one of its hardest shocks. During the night, fear exaggerates distance. The enemy feels everywhere because he cannot be seen. In morning, distance becomes measurable again, and sometimes that measurement is terrible. 10 yards, 5 yards, 2 yards, inside the wire, inside the trench, behind the gun. At places like Chongchon, Chosin, and later Chipyong-ni, the Chinese method of infiltration, pressure on flanks, and repeated night attacks meant that many American positions did not merely face assault from far away. They were reached, entered, or nearly entered. The US Army's campaign summary describes Chinese forces in late 1950 as having moved from Manchuria under cover of darkness and camouflage by day, remaining hard to detect in rugged mountain terrain before their offensive struck United Nations forces. That explanation belongs to the larger history. The morning after belonged to the men who saw the footprints. There were always footprints if the ground allowed them. In snow they could be shocking. The dark hillside that had seemed empty was marked with paths of men. Tracks across a draw, tracks near the wire, tracks circling toward a flank, tracks behind a position where nobody wanted to see tracks. The footprints made the night concrete. They showed where the attackers had crawled, where they had bunched, where they had fallen back, where they had carried wounded away, and where they had passed unseen. For a soldier who had spent hours telling himself he was imagining movement, those tracks could feel like accusation. You were right to be afraid. They were there. Then came the counting. Counting is one of the ordinary jobs that becomes unbearable after combat. Count ammunition first, because the next attack may come before grief has time to become grief. How many rifle rounds remain? How many grenades? How many belts for the machine gun? Are the mortars supplied? Is the gun still working? Is the radio working? Is the field phone line cut? Are there batteries? Can anyone reach the company command post? Are the roads open? Every answer matters because morning is not a guarantee that the night is over for good. It is only the next phase of survival. Then count the men. A sergeant moves down the position, or an officer does, or whoever is still able to do it. He checks each hole. Who is here? Who is wounded? Who is missing? Where is Miller? Did anyone see Harris? Where is the assistant gunner? Was the medic hit? Did anyone from the listening post get back? Some men answer for themselves. Some are answered for by others. Some do not answer. In the night, absence can be hidden by noise and confusion. In morning, absence becomes a name that does not reply. This was not only a military task, it was a human ritual forced into military form. Morning after a night attack required men to convert friends into numbers because the army needed reports. Killed, wounded, missing, ammunition expenditure, enemy dead counted, enemy prisoners taken, position status. The words had to be exact enough to move through the chain of command, but the reality below them resisted neatness. A man listed as missing might be dead somewhere beyond the wire, captured, hiding, wounded in a draw, or walking toward friendly lines hours later. A man listed as wounded might be only lightly hurt or might be dying while someone tried to find a litter. A position listed as restored might be held by half the men who occupied it the evening before. The report could be accurate and still inadequate. The wounded came next, though in truth they had been there all along. The morning only made it easier to reach some of them. Medics and corpsmen had already worked through the night where they could, moving by sound and memory, crawling when necessary, doing what could be done with cold hands and limited light. Morning allowed more movement, but it also revealed more need. Men were carried back from holes, from wire, from ditches, from slopes where they had lain through the firing. Some could walk with help. Some insisted they could walk and then collapsed. Some were quiet in a way that worried the medics more than screaming. In the cold, wounds were complicated by exposure. A man who survived the bullet or fragment still had to survive the temperature, the delay, the road, and the next enemy shell. At Chosin, this problem became part of the battle itself. Severe cold, isolation, and heavy Chinese pressure meant evacuation was never simple. The Marine Corps describes the reservoir fight as a brutal 2-week battle in which roughly 30,000 US, South Korean, and British troops faced about 120,000 Chinese troops in extreme winter conditions. Numbers like that make sense in an overview, But morning after a night attack reduced the numbers to very practical questions. Can he be moved? Is there a vehicle? Is the road cut? Is there morphine? Can the helicopter come later, if weather and enemy fire allow it? Will he live long enough to reach the aid station? The morning did not answer these questions kindly. It only forced them to be asked. Then there were the dead. Every army has procedures for the dead, and procedures matter. They protect dignity when emotion cannot. Dog tags, identification, personal effects, grave registration, removal from the line if possible. But in the first morning after an attack, procedure often meant exhaustion. Men who had not slept had to lift bodies stiffened by cold. They had to separate American dead from Chinese dead. They had to check whether someone who looked dead still breathed. They had to move bodies out of fighting positions because the positions were still needed. This is one of the hardest parts to say plainly, but it is true. A foxhole could not remain only a place of mourning. It had to become a fighting position again. The living needed it before a night returned. Chinese dead near the wire told their own story. They showed how close the attack had come, how hard the attackers had pressed, and how costly the assault had been. American soldiers often remembered seeing bodies in large numbers after repulsed attacks, especially where machine guns and artillery had caught men in the open or near obstacles. But that sight did not always bring comfort. It could produce a grim satisfaction, certainly. The position had held. The enemy had paid. Yet it could also deepen the dread. If so many had been killed and still some reached the trench, what would happen if more came tonight? If they were willing to cross that ground once, would they do it again? The National Museum of the United States Army preserves a Chinese bugle connected to memories of night assaults, and one veteran recollection it shares describes the trench floor after repeated attacks as fouled with blood before the bugle sounded again from the darkness. That is the part of mourning that refuses all romance. The trench had to be cleaned, repaired, and occupied again. Repair began almost immediately. Men fixed wire where it had been cut or flattened. They deepened holes if the ground allowed it. They shifted machine guns. They moved ammunition forward. They marked dead ground, the places attackers had used for cover. They checked fields of fire. They looked at the slope in daylight and tried to understand how the enemy had approached. This was not only practical, it was psychological. To study the ground was to regain some control over it. There is the draw they used. Put more fire there. There is the gap in the wire. Close it. There is the rock that blocked the gunner's view. Shift the gun. Fear becomes more bearable when it can be turned into work. Officers walked the line and did what officers have always had to do after a hard night. Assess damage, give orders, speak with confidence, and conceal the right amount of uncertainty. Too much calm could seem dishonest. Too much worry could spread. The men watched their leaders closely. A lieutenant's face, a captain's tone, a sergeant's joke, a battalion runner arriving with news, all of it mattered. In combat, morale is often made from small signs. If the officer is still moving, maybe the line is not broken. If the sergeant is angry about ammunition rather than afraid of being surrounded, maybe things are still manageable. If hot food appears, even once, maybe the rear still exists. Food after a night attack could feel strangely important. Not because it was good, it often was not. Rations might be frozen, cold, rushed, or eaten with dirty hands. Coffee might be weak or half spilled. But food proved that ordinary bodily needs had survived the night. A man chewing something after an attack was doing a simple human act in a place that had tried to reduce him to reaction. He might not taste it. He might eat because someone told him to. He might hold the cup with both hands more for warmth than thirst. Still, food mattered. Coffee mattered, cigarettes mattered, dry socks mattered if they existed. These were not luxuries. They were small repairs to the self. The daylight also brought aircraft, if weather allowed, and that changed the feeling of the battlefield. During the night, many soldiers felt that darkness favoured the Chinese. In daylight, American air power and artillery could reassert themselves. Planes overhead meant the world had widened again. The enemy could no longer move as freely in the open. Roads and ridges could be watched. Artillery observers could see more. The US Air Force's Korean War materials note that during the first year of the conflict, interdiction attacks targeted trains, bridges, roads, and trucks in an effort to slow communist transportation. For a soldier who had spent the night feeling surrounded by invisible men, the sound of friendly aircraft could be deeply reassuring. But reassurance was not the same as rest. The planes would not sit in the foxhole after dark. The men would. This is why morning after a night attack often carried two opposite feelings at the same time: relief and dread. Relief because the night had been survived. Dread because survival had to be repeated. A man might feel grateful for dawn and already fear sunset. The day became a narrow working space between attacks. Clean the weapon, fix the wire, bury or move the dead, evacuate the wounded, eat, sleep if ordered. Write a note if possible. Check the ridge, listen to rumours, prepare for night. That rhythm could make time feel less like a calendar and more like a wheel. In places where the larger situation was collapsing, morning could bring worse news than the night. Along the Chonchon River, after Chinese attacks broke through and United Nations units withdrew, roads became crowded with troops, refugees, trucks, tanks, and equipment, while the US 2nd Division fought delaying actions and suffered heavily during the retreat. The Army's Korean War campaign summary describes 8th Army pulling back under pressure and suffering heavy losses during hand-to-hand fighting and withdrawals across clogged roads. For the men on those roads, morning did not mean a stable position to repair. It meant movement under threat. It meant abandoned equipment. It meant trying to pass through valleys where high ground might already be occupied. It meant a night attack's aftermath could become a daylight retreat. A retreat after night fighting had its own humiliations and dangers. Weapons too heavy to move might be destroyed or left. Vehicles might be abandoned if the road was blocked. Wounded men had to be loaded quickly or carried. Units mixed together. Men looked for officers. Officers looked for units. And everyone looked for the road that was still open. Rumour thrived in that kind of movement. The Chinese are ahead. The bridge is gone. The rearguard is cut off. The roadblock is cleared. The roadblock is not cleared. Keep moving. Turn back. Wait. Go on foot. In such moments, fear did not need darkness anymore. The night had taught it how to operate. For a man who survived one of these attacks and then lived through the morning, memory began forming almost immediately. Not complete memory. Fragmented memory. The bugle. The flare. The man who would not wake. The shape near the wire. The cold in the hands after the firing stopped. The strange taste of coffee. The sight of enemy bodies closer than expected. The sound of someone laughing too hard. The officer saying, "Dig deeper." Memory did not arrange itself like a history book. It arranged itself around impact. Later, when veterans told these stories, they often returned to the same details because those were the details the mind had kept. Morning also exposed the difference between what men believed in the dark and what had actually happened. Sometimes a position that felt surrounded had only been probed. Sometimes a suspected breakthrough had been stopped quickly. Sometimes the enemy dead were fewer than imagined. Sometimes they were far more. Sometimes a rumour of disaster elsewhere turned out false. Sometimes it turned out understated. This process of correction mattered, but it did not erase the emotion of the night. A soldier could learn that the attack had been smaller than he thought, and still remember it as enormous, because his body had experienced it that way. The body does not revise fear as neatly as a report revises numbers. There were prisoners sometimes. A Chinese soldier captured after a night attack might be brought in at dawn, wounded or exhausted, guarded by men who had spent the night trying to kill men like him. This could be a strange moment. The enemy who had seemed like a mass in darkness became one person. Cold, young or middle-aged, hungry, silent, angry, afraid, wounded, or simply empty with fatigue. He might carry little equipment. He might look less like the unstoppable figure of rumour and more like another infantryman who had been pushed through a terrible night. That did not make American losses easier. It did remind anyone willing to see it that the shadows had been men. This recognition was not always welcome. Hatred can be useful in combat because it simplifies the world. Seeing the enemy as human complicates things, and exhausted soldiers often had no appetite for complication. They had friends to bury, and another night to prepare for. Still, the morning could force reality into view. The Chinese were not ghosts. They had crossed the same freezing ground, suffered under the same cold sky, and left the same kind of blood in the snow. The terror they caused was real, and so was their own suffering. History is often hardest when both things are true. By the time the sun rose fully, if the weather allowed it, the battlefield became almost ordinary in its demands. Work replaced shock. Men were assigned tasks. Patrols might go out to check the slopes. Engineers repaired obstacles. Ammunition parties moved boxes forward. Communications men fixed lines. Medics organised evacuation. Cooks and drivers and clerks did what they could, often close enough to danger that job titles meant little. The Korean War repeatedly erased the comfort of rear and front. A man could be support personnel in the morning and fighting for a perimeter by night. At Chipyong-ni, the morning after repeated attacks had a different meaning because the perimeter held. The defenders had endured assaults around a vital road junction, and the stand became a demonstration that Chinese attacks could be stopped by prepared units with coordinated fire support. The Army Heritage account identifies Chipyong-ni as a key target during the Chinese and North Korean offensive that began on February 11, 1951, and the battle became remembered as a major defensive success. But even successful mornings were heavy. Holding a perimeter did not make the night harmless. It meant the men had paid enough to still be there. That is something worth remembering carefully. The morning after a night attack was not only aftermath, it was preparation. Every lesson from the night had to be turned into a plan before darkness returned. The enemy used that draw, cover it. The wire failed there, strengthen it. Men fired too high, correct them. Ammunition ran short at that gun, move more forward. The listening post was too far out or not far enough. Change it. The left flank nearly lost contact. Tie it in. Fear became doctrine at the smallest scale. Pain became adjustment. And somewhere inside all of that, men had to remain human. They might take a photograph from a pocket and look at it for a few seconds. They might write a letter that said very little about the night. They might share a cigarette. They might curse the cold, the officers, the enemy, the food, the hills, and the war itself. They might sit quietly beside a friend who had stopped talking. They might sleep at last in daylight, not because it felt safe, but because the body finally overruled the mind. A man asleep after a night attack often did not look peaceful. He looked removed, taken out of the world for a short time by exhaustion. This is where the story of Chinese night attacks reaches its most ordinary and most painful point. The terror was not only in the bugle, not only in the rush, not only in the trench fight. It was in the requirement to continue afterward, to stand up in the morning, to count the men, to clean the rifle, to repair the hole, to eat something, to carry the wounded, to move the dead, to listen to orders, to prepare to do it again. War often asks for courage in dramatic moments, but it also asks for a duller kind of courage after the dramatic moment has passed. The courage to keep functioning. So when we think about those mornings in Korea, we should not imagine them as clean endings to violent nights. They were grey, cold, practical, and full of evidence. They smelled of powder, smoke, blood, frozen earth, wet wool, coffee, oil, and fear that had not fully left. They sounded like low voices, tools striking frozen ground, weapons being cleaned, stretchers being lifted, radios crackling, and the occasional distant firing that reminded everyone the larger battle was still moving. They looked like men older than they had been the day before, and then, always, the sun moved. The day advanced whether the men were ready or not. Shadow shortened and then lengthened again. The hills that had been examined in daylight began to lose detail. The repaired wire darkened. The drawers filled with black. Men who had survived one night understood that morning had not defeated darkness. It had only interrupted it. They checked ammunition again. They pulled coats tighter. They looked toward the ridges. They listened for the first small sign that the enemy was moving, and in that listening the previous night remained present, not as memory alone, but as instruction. The bugle might come again. The whistles might rise again. The shadows might reach the trenches again. Morning had shown them what darkness had done, and evening asked whether they could face it one more time.